before the marble columns of Rome rose to dominate the known world, and before the golden eagles of the legions cast their long, sharp shadows across history. There was the mist. It was a heavy, ancient vapor that clung to the valleys of Gaul, a white shroud that turned the dense forests into a realm of secrets and silence. To understand the woman who would one day hold the fate of emperors in a small, golden box, one must first understand the soil from which she grew. She was not born of stone and statute, but of damp earth, rotting leaves, and the quiet, persistent struggle of the wild. In the mid-1st century, the land that is now France was a place of deep, brooding greens and greys. The Roman conquest was complete, ostensibly, but in the heart of the countryside, the old ways lingered like the scent of wood smoke after a fire has died. Here, the boundaries between the medicinal and the magical were thin, woven together by the practitioners of the old Druidic traditions. It was in this world, beneath the canopy of ancient oaks and twisting vines, that the story of Locusta began. Imagine the silence of a Gallic forest at dawn. The air is cool and wet, tasting of pine needles and rich dark loam. The sun struggles to pierce the fog, sending only pale fractured beams of light to the forest floor. In this stillness, a young girl moves. She walks without sound, her feet knowing the rhythm of the roots and the moss. She is not afraid of the woods. The woods are her library, her temple, and her arsenal. While others might look at the tangled undergrowth and see only chaos, she sees a meticulously organized cabinet of curiosities, each leaf and berry holding a specific, potent potential. Her origins are obscured by the same mist that covered her homeland. History, written by the Romans who would eventually fear her, tells us little of her parents or her birth. Some say she was born into a lineage of wise women, the hedge-witches, who lived on the periphery of the villages, tending to the sick and the dying with the same dispassionate hands. Others suggest she was a child of the wild itself, an orphan who learned to survive by watching what the deer ate and what the wolves avoided. But what is certain is that she possessed a mind that was rare for her time, a mind that did not fear the darkness of nature, but sought to categorize it. She learned early that the difference between a healer and a killer is often merely a matter of weight. A pinch of dried leaves could soothe a fever. 2 pinches could stop a heart. This delicate balance, the razor's edge between life and death, fascinated her. She became a student of the shadows. She learned the language of the aconite, the plant known as wolfsbane or monkshood. She admired its tall, proud spikes of purple-blue flowers shaped like the helmets of soldiers. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but beneath the beauty lay a toxin that could paralyze the nerves and slow the pulse until it simply ceased to be. To the uninitiated, it was just a flower. To her, it was a sleeping power waiting to be woken. She studied the belladonna, the deadly nightshade. She saw how its berries, dark and glossy as polished obsidian, looked sweet and inviting, like the eyes of a lover or a ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. She learned that eating them brought madness, hallucinations, and a drift into a sleep from which there was no waking. But she also learned that in minute doses it could dilate the pupils, making a woman appear more beautiful, more striking. It was the plant of deception, of vanity and death entwined, and she respected it as one respects a treacherous but useful friend. And there was henbane, with its pale, sickly yellow flowers veined with purple, smelling of decay even when it was in bloom. It was a plant of the underworld, used by the Druids to induce trances, to speak with the gods. She learned to harvest it by the light of the moon, not out of superstition, but because she understood the rhythms of the sap and the moisture, the way the chemistry of the plant changed with the cycle of the day. This was her education. There were no marble halls, no scrolls of philosophy. Her classroom was the forest floor. Her exams were the mixtures she brewed in earthen pots over low fires. She developed a clinical detachment, a trait that would define her entire existence. When she tested her concoctions on the small animals of the woods, it was not out of cruelty, but out of a need for certainty. She needed to know the timing. How long until the breath hitched? How long until the muscles seized? How long until the eyes glazed over? She watched with the cold, clear gaze of a scientist, recording the results in the vast, silent catalogue of her memory. As she grew, the isolation of the forest began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The Roman influence was spreading, their roads slicing through the ancient woods like scars. Tales of the great city, the Caput Mundi, filtered north with the traders and the soldiers. They spoke of a city of white stone and gold, a place where ambition was the only god that truly mattered. For a woman with her specific lethal talents, the village offered only a life of suspicion and small necessities. But Rome offered a marketplace for everything, even death. Whether she was taken as a slave, captured during a suppression of a local revolt, or whether she walked willingly down the Via Agrippa toward the south, remains a subject of whispers. But the image of her voluntary migration carries a haunting weight. Imagine her packing her satchel, not with clothes or jewels, but with dried roots, vials of distilled sap, and the seeds of her favorite flowers. She carried the Gallic forest with her, a portable wilderness tucked into the folds of her tunic. Leaving the mist of Gaul for the sun-drenched, chaotic sprawl of Rome was a shock to the senses. The air in Rome did not smell of pine and rain. It smelled of dust, unwashed bodies, exotic spices, and smoke. The noise was a physical wall, a cacophony of shouting vendors, rattling chariot wheels, and the endless hum of a million souls living atop one another. Yet, amidst this chaos, she found a familiar pattern. Rome, she realized, was just another forest. The senators and patricians were the old oaks, fighting for sunlight, their roots strangling the saplings beneath them. The common people were the undergrowth, dense and tangled, and in the shadows of this stone forest there was a desperate need for the kind of silence she could provide. She took the name Locusta. In the Latin tongue, it meant locust. It was a strange name for a woman, invoking images of a plague, a swarm that consumes everything in its path, leaving nothing but bare stalks behind. It was a name that suggested an elemental force, something inevitable and devastating. Perhaps it was given to her by a Roman master who saw the hunger in her eyes. Or perhaps she chose it herself, a warning to those who would underestimate the quiet woman from the north. In Rome, she did not initially walk the halls of palaces. She began in the Subura, the crowded, dangerous lower districts where life was cheap and questions were rarely asked. Here, her skills were honed on a different kind of prey. The jealous wife who wanted to be a widow, the merchant who needed a rival to fall ill before a crucial deal, the gladiator who wanted to weaken an opponent. She became a phantom in the city's underbelly, a vendor of whisper-quiet solutions. Her reputation grew like the vine she once tended. She was known for her precision. Other poisoners were clumsy. They used brute force, substances that caused violent, bloody deaths that screamed of foul play. Locusta was an artist. She could craft a death that looked like a stopping of the heart, a sudden fever, or a simple choking fit. She understood that the best poison is the one that leaves no history, the one that allows the grieving family to believe it was the will of the gods rather than the hand of a human. It was during this time that she began to perfect the art of the double poison, a technique that would later serve the highest powers in the empire. She learned that some toxins worked best when layered, one to lower the defenses, the second to strike the fatal blow. She experimented with masking agents, mixing bitter herbs with strong wines, hiding the metallic taste of arsenic within the rich savour of roasted meats. She was creating a symphony of chemistry, playing the humours of the human body like a harp. But the path of the poisoner is a treacherous one. In a city governed by law and paranoia, secrets are a currency that devalues quickly. By the year 54 AD, the name Locusta had reached ears that were too powerful, and her trade had drawn the gaze of the law. She was no longer the invisible hedge-witch. She was a known quantity, a woman who held too many lives in her hands. The authorities descended. The damp cell of the Roman prison replaced the open air of the Subura. She was condemned to die, her skills deemed too dangerous to exist within the boundaries of civilization. She sat in the darkness of the Tullianum, the stone pressing in on her, awaiting the executioner's blade. It seemed the locust had been caught, her swarm dispersed. But in Rome, the line between a criminal and a state asset is often drawn by necessity. High above her dungeon, on the Palatine Hill, a woman of immense ambition and ruthless intellect was plotting a change in the succession. Agrippina the Younger, the empress, needed a tool. She did not need a soldier, and she did not need a politician. She needed a ghost who understood the chemistry of silence. The guards came for Locusta not to lead her to her death, but to bring her into the light of a new, darker purpose. The heavy iron door creaked open, the torchlight flooding the damp cell, revealing the woman from Gaul sitting calmly, her hands resting in her lap, her mind likely drifting back to the purple flowers of the aconite swaying in the northern wind. She stood up, the chains rattling softly, and walked out of the cell. She was leaving the world of petty crimes and entering the arena of history. The forest had prepared her for survival, but Rome would demand of her a masterpiece. The mist of her homeland was gone, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of imperial ambition, and Locusta, the Locust of Gaul, was ready to feed. The stone corridors of the Mamertine prison faded behind her, replaced by the cool night air of the Roman streets. She was led not to the executioner's block, but into a covered litter, the curtains drawn tight against the prying eyes of the city. The journey was a quiet ascent. The sounds of the bustling Suburra, the shouts of merchants, the barking of stray dogs, the clatter of carts slowly receding as they climbed the Palatine Hill. Here the air changed. The stench of the Tiber and the unwashed masses was replaced by the scent of manicured gardens, of jasmine and cedar, and the cold metallic smell of imperial power. Locusta sat in the darkness of the litter, her hands still rough from the damp stone of her cell, her mind sharpening. She knew that in Rome, mercy was a transaction. If she was being moved from the shadow of death, it was because someone required her particular brand of darkness. She was brought before Agrippina the Younger, the empress, a woman whose ambition consumed the air around her like a fire in a sealed room. The arrangement was unspoken, but understood. The Emperor Claudius, an aging man whose grip on the throne had become an inconvenience to his wife's plans for her son Nero, had to be removed. But he could not die by the sword, for that would invite rebellion. He could not die by open violence, for that would stain the legitimacy of the succession. He had to die by nature or by something that mimicked it so perfectly that even the gods would be deceived. Agrippina needed the woman from Gaul, the woman who knew the secrets of the earth. Locusta was given a laboratory within the palace complex, a room of stone and silence where she could ply her trade without interruption. She worked with the clinical detachment of a scholar. She did not see murder. She saw chemistry. She requested specific ingredients, roots and leaves she had known since her childhood in the wild forests of Gaul. Aconite for the heart, hemlock for the paralysis, belladonna to dilate the pupils and mask the pain. She distilled these essences, testing the viscosity, the smell, and the taste. She knew that Claudius loved mushrooms, particularly the rich, savoury belletti. It was the perfect vehicle. The earthiness of the fungus would mask the bitterness of the toxin. The night of the banquet arrived in 54 AD. The palace was awash in lamplight and the sound of lyres. Locusta did not attend. She waited in the shadows, her part already played. The dish was served. The emperor ate. But the constitution of Claudius was stronger than anticipated, or perhaps the wine he drank diluted the potency of the dose. He fell ill, yes, clutching his stomach and gasping for air, but he did not die. Panic rippled through the conspirators. If he survived, if he woke the next morning with the clarity of a man who has tasted betrayal, they were all dead. It was in this moment of crisis that the true nature of Locusta's value became clear. She had not just prepared a single poison, she had prepared for contingencies. As the emperor vomited, seeking relief, his physician, Xenophon likely complicit in the plot, approached him under the guise of aiding the purge. He held a feather, ostensibly to tickle the back of the emperor's throat and induce vomiting. But the feather had been dipped in Locusta's most concentrated elixir. a rapid-acting venom that bypassed the stomach and entered the bloodstream directly through the mucous membranes. The feather brushed the throat. The throat closed. The breathing stopped. The Emperor Claudius passed into history, and his stepson, the young Nero, stepped into the light. For a brief moment, Locusta was forgotten, a discarded tool left in the corner of the workshop. But the new reign of Nero was built on precarious foundations. There was a rival, Britannicus, the natural son of Claudius. He was young, barely a teenager, but he was a living reminder of the old order, a threat that grew with every passing day. Nero, barely a man himself, but consumed by a paranoia that would later define his rule, summoned the woman from Gaul once more. This time, however, the request came with a terrifying urgency. Locusta was not asked. She was commanded. She prepared a draught for the boy Britannicus, a subtle poison designed to look like a natural illness. But she had been too cautious. She had diluted the dose, fearing that a sudden death would implicate the new emperor too obviously. When Britannicus drank it, he merely suffered a bout of illness, a passing weakness that cleared within days. Nero's rage was absolute. He did not possess the cold calculation of his mother. His was a fiery, petulant violence. He had Locusta dragged to his chambers. There, in the heart of the Golden Palace, the Emperor of Rome beat the poisoner with his own hands, flogging her until she could barely stand. He screamed that she had given the boy a remedy, not a poison, that she was a coward, that she was failing him. He gave her an ultimatum: produce a toxin that would kill as instantly as a sword stroke, or she would be executed immediately. Fear is a potent catalyst for genius. Back in her laboratory, under the watchful eyes of the Praetorian Guard, Locusta worked with a feverish intensity. She abandoned caution. She brewed a concoction of terrifying potency, distilling the lethal alkaloids of wolfsbane and arsenic into a clear, tasteless liquid. She did not test this on rabbits or dogs. She tested it on a pig and then a boar, timing the seconds it took for the beasts to fall. When the boar died almost instantly, she knew she had the mixture Nero demanded. The delivery system required a masterstroke of social engineering. At the imperial banquets, Britannicus was guarded by a food taster, a servant whose sole purpose was to sample every dish and cup before it touched the prince's lips. Poisoning the wine directly was impossible. The taster would die, and the alarm would be raised before Britannicus took a sip. Locusta and Nero devised a plan that exploited the laws of physics as much as the chemistry of death. At the next banquet, Britannicus was served a cup of wine. It was harmless, and the taster drank from it without issue. But the wine had been heated to a scalding temperature, too hot to drink. This was not uncommon. Romans often drank their wine warm. Britannicus, finding the cup too hot, pushed it away and asked for it to be cooled. This was the moment. A servant, instructed beforehand, brought a pitcher of cold water to temper the heat of the wine. The poison was not in the wine, it was in the water. Since the water was merely an additive to a cup already proven safe, the taster did not sample it. The cold water mixed with the hot wine, bringing it to a perfect, drinkable temperature. Britannicus raised the cup. He drank deep. The effect was instantaneous. He did not cry out. He did not gasp. The strength of Locusta's brew was such that his voice was seized before it could form a sound. He fell backward from his couch, his body rigid, his eyes rolling back. The banquet hall fell into a stunned silence. Guests rose in horror. But Nero, reclining on his couch with a terrifying calm, waved his hand dismissively. He told the guests to sit, claiming that his stepbrother was merely suffering from a fit of epilepsy, a condition he had known since childhood. He urged them to continue eating, to let the boy recover in peace. As the guests nervously resumed their meal, the life flickered out of Britannicus on the floor beside them. The murder was a success, but the aftermath required one final act of concealment. The poison, potent and harsh, had turned the skin of the young prince a dark, bruised colour, a telltale sign of unnatural death. To display such a body at the funeral would be an admission of guilt. Locusta advised that the body be covered in gypsum, a white chalky plaster that would mask the discoloration and give the corpse the pale, marble-like appearance of a sleeping youth. The funeral procession began the very next day. The body was carried through the streets on an open bier, the gypsum hiding the truth of the assassination. But the gods, it seemed, had a sense of irony. As the procession wound its way toward the Campus Martius, the skies darkened. A torrential rainstorm broke over Rome, a deluge of such violence that the mourners scattered. The rain beat down upon the corpse of Britannicus. It washed away the gypsum. The white mask dissolved, running in milky streams down the sides of the bier, revealing the blackened, bruised skin beneath. The people of Rome saw the face of the murdered boy, and they knew. They whispered of poison, of Nero, and of the witch from Gaul. But Nero did not care for the whispers of the mob. He was ecstatic. Locusta had given him the ultimate power, the power to kill without drawing a blade. He did not execute her. He did not cast her back into the darkness. Instead, he exalted her. He granted her a full pardon for all her past crimes. He bestowed upon her vast estates in the countryside, lands where she could grow her herbs in peace. Most remarkably, he institutionalized her craft. Nero began to send students to her, young men and women who showed an aptitude for the quiet arts. Locusta became a professor of death. In her country villa, surrounded by fields of hemlock and nightshade that waved gently in the Italian breeze, she taught the next generation of poisoners how to extract the sap, how to measure the dose, how to hide the taste. She had become a state institution, the headmistress of a university of shadows. She lived in a strange golden twilight. She was wealthy, feared, and protected by the emperor himself. Nero's reliance on her deepened as his reign spiraled into tyranny. He became obsessed with the idea of his own demise, fearing a coup or a rebellion. He commissioned Locusta to create a special poison for him, a failsafe. She crafted a substance of immense power and placed it in a small, golden box. Nero carried this box with him everywhere, a comfort object that promised him a painless exit should the world turn against him. He trusted Locusta's chemistry more than he trusted his own guards. Locusta of Gaul, once a prisoner in the damp cells of the Mamertine, now walked through her gardens in silk robes. She would touch the leaves of the plants with a lover's tenderness, knowing that within their fibers lay the power to topple dynasties. She had survived the brutality of the dungeon, the pressure of the empress, and the madness of the emperor. She had turned her knowledge of the wild, chaotic nature of Gaul into a disciplined, imperial weapon. Yet as he looked out over her fields, watching the sun dip below the horizon and casting long shadows across the rows of toxic blooms, she must have known that this safety was an illusion. In the world she inhabited, usefulness was the only currency, and usefulness is a finite resource. The wind that rustled through the cypress trees whispered of change. The reign of Nero was becoming a fire that would consume Rome itself, and when the fire burns too hot, it eventually consumes the hand that feeds it. The golden box in Nero's pocket was a promise of an end. But for Locusta, the story was still being written in the ledger of survival. The shadows of the Suburra had been left behind, but the shadows of the human heart were far deeper and far harder to escape. As the sun vanished and the first stars appeared above the Roman countryside, the silence of the estate was profound. It was the silence of a held breath, the pause between the intake and the exhale, the stillness before the inevitable storm. Locusta returned to her villa, the hem of her robe brushing against the stone floor, her work for the day complete, but her vigilance never resting. She was the mother of poisons, and she knew better than anyone that everything eventually reaches its lethal dose. But memory is a ghost that haunts even the most fortified of sanctuaries. While Locusta's body rested in the safety of her country estate, surrounded by the fruits of her dark labor, her mind drifted back through the currents of time, pulled by an invisible tide toward the place where her true ascent began. The scent of the cypress trees outside her window faded, replaced by the acrid metallic tang of a Roman dungeon. The warmth of the evening air was sucked away, leaving only the bone-deep chill of the Tullianum, that subterranean holding cell where hope went to die. It was the year 54. The glorious sun of Italy could not penetrate the heavy stone walls that encased her then. She had been a different woman, or perhaps merely a rougher, unpolished version of the creature she would become. In those days, she was known simply as the woman from Gaul, a foreigner with a dangerous knowledge of the earth's hidden venoms, and she sat in the dark awaiting the executioner's blade. She had been condemned for the crime of poisoning, a practice the Romans publicly reviled yet privately coveted. Her hands, now adorned with rings of gold, were then bound in rough iron chains that chafed against her skin, leaving raw, red reminders of her powerlessness. The darkness of the cell was absolute, save for the occasional flicker of a guard's torch passing the barred grate far above. Time had lost its meaning in that damp abyss. There was only the dripping of water, the scuttling of unseen vermin, and the steady, rhythmic beating of her own heart drum, counting down the moments until the end. She had accepted her fate with the stoicism of her druidic ancestors, understanding that nature gives and nature takes, and she had merely been an agent of that cycle. The cycle was not yet finished with her. The heavy grate above groaned, the sound of grinding metal echoing through the hollow chamber like a thunderclap. A shaft of light pierced the gloom, blinding in its intensity, and a ladder was lowered. It was not the executioner who descended, nor a guard come to taunt her. The figure that emerged from the shadows was draped in the finest wool, a cloak of deep imperial purple that seemed to absorb the dim light of the torch she carried. The air in the cell shifted, the stench of mould and decay retreating before a wave of perfume rose oil, sandalwood, and the sharp cold scent of ambition. Agrippina the Younger stood before the prisoner, the Empress of Rome, the wife of the Emperor Claudius, and the mother of the boy who would be Nero. In the flickering light her face was a mask of marble perfection, etched with lines of calculated cruelty and immense crushing pressure. She did not look at the squalor of the cell. Her gaze was fixed solely on Locusta, assessing her not as a human being, but as a tool found in the dust, waiting to be sharpened. There were no pleasantries exchanged in that buried room. The language spoken was one of necessity and survival. Agrippina spoke in a voice that was low and smooth, like a blade sliding into a sheath. She spoke of the Emperor Claudius, a man she described not with love, but with the weary impatience one might feel toward an obstacle in the road. Claudius was old, she said, and his mind was wavering. He was prone to listening to the wrong whispers, whispers that might endanger the succession of her beloved son, Nero. Rome needed a new sun to rise, but the old sun refused to set. Locusta listened, her eyes adjusting to the light, her mind racing. She understood the bargain before it was even offered. Her life, currently forfeit to the state, could be purchased. The currency was death. To leave this tomb of stone, she had to help put the emperor into a tomb of his own. It was a transaction as old as power itself. The empress needed a key to unlock the throne for her son, and that key was chemistry. The deal was struck in the silence of the nod. There was no need for parchment or witnesses. Locusta was whisked away from the damp squalor of the prison under the cover of night, moved to a secreted chamber within the palace complex where the tools of her trade awaited her. It was a strange purgatory. No longer a prisoner, yet not quite free. She was a ghost in the machine of the empire. Here, she was given access to the ingredients she had missed so dearly. The dried leaves, the crushed roots, the distilled essences of the darker side of nature. She set to work with the focus of an artist. The request was specific. Agrippina did not want a violent, bloody death that would scream of murder. She needed a poison that mimicked the natural failings of an old man's body. A sudden illness, a seizure, a stopping of the heart. It had to be swift enough to prevent Claudius from changing his will, yet slow enough to allow for the theatre of mourning. Locusta turned to her knowledge of the fungi that grew in the dark forests of Gaul. She selected the death cap, Amanita phylloides, and a specific lethal belletti that resembled the emperor's favorite dish. She distilled the essence, concentrating the toxins until a single drop held the weight of an empire. She worked with a cold detachment, grinding the dried mushrooms into a fine, undetectable powder, mixing it with the juices of savory meat to mask any bitterness. This was her art, her science, her salvation. She was not killing a man, she was solving a puzzle. The day of the banquet arrived, the 13th of October. The palace was alive with the sounds of revelry. Locusta did not attend the feast. She remained in the shadows, a silent observer in the wings of the great stage. She imagined the scene as she had been told it would unfold. The Emperor Claudius, reclining on his couch, his face flashed with wine and indulgence, surrounded by sycophants and family. The dish of mushrooms would be presented, a special delicacy reserved for the ruler of the world. History records the tension of that meal, the heavy atmosphere that hung over the triclinium. Agrippina watched with hawk-like intensity as her husband reached for the poison succulent. He ate. The poison entered his system, a silent invader masking itself as nourishment. But the chemistry of a living body is unpredictable, and even the master poisoner cannot control every variable. Claudius fell ill, but he did not die immediately. The dosage, perhaps diluted by the sheer volume of wine and food he had consumed, or perhaps expelled by his body's violent rejection of the toxin, failed to stop his heart. Chaos ensued. The emperor was retching, gasping for air, his face turning a terrifying shade of purple, but he was still breathing. He was still the emperor. If he survived this, if he realized the treachery, the wrath of Rome would fall upon Agrippina and Locusta alike. In the panicked corridors of the palace, word reached Locusta that the poison had not finished its work. The fear that gripped her then was colder than the prison cell had ever been. Failure meant a death far worse than beheading. It meant torture. It meant being made an example of. But Agrippina was not a woman to be thwarted by half measures. The empress, seeing her plan unraveling, summoned her trusted physician, Xenophon. Whether Xenophon was already part of the conspiracy, or merely coerced in that desperate moment, remains a whisper in the halls of history. But the solution he employed bore the signature of Locusta's guidance. As the emperor gasped, choking on his own bile, the physician approached under the guise of aiding him to vomit, a common practice at Roman feasts. He held a feather ostensibly to tickle the back of the emperor's throat, but the feather was not innocent. It had been dipped in a second, more potent concentration of Locusta's brewer rapid-acting neurotoxin likely derived from the monkshood plant, aconite. When the feather brushed the mucous membranes of Claudius's throat, the poison was absorbed instantly, bypassing the stomach entirely. The emperor's struggles ceased. The convulsions slowed into a terrible stillness. The sun had set. Locusta breathed again. The deed was done. The immediate threat of execution evaporated, replaced by a strange, tenuous security. She had proven her worth to the most powerful woman in the world. Claudius was dead, and Nero, the golden boy, was proclaimed emperor. The transition of power was smooth, orchestrated by the same hand that had offered Locusta her freedom. Yet, freedom in the court of the Caesars was a relative term. Locusta was now a keeper of the deepest state secret. She was the woman who had widowed the empress and made the new emperor an orphan. Such knowledge was dangerous. She was moved from the shadows of the palace to a more comfortable confinement, kept close, kept watched. She was no longer a prisoner in chains, but a prisoner of her own utility. She watched from a distance as Nero took the throne, a young man of 17, full of artistic pretension and latent madness. At first he seemed uninterested in the dark arts that had paved his way. He played his lyre, he recited poetry, he indulged in the pleasures of the flesh. But the seeds of paranoia are planted deep in the soil of absolute power, and it was not long before they began to sprout. The ghost of the old emperor still lingered, not in spirit, but in the form of his biological son Britannicus. The boy was younger than Nero, just approaching his 14th birthday, the age of manhood in Rome. As long as Britannicus lived, there were those who would whisper that he was the true heir, the rightful blood of Claudius. Agrippina, finding her influence over Nero waning as the young emperor grew more independent and resentful of her control, began to threaten him with this very fact. She threatened to support Britannicus, to turn the legions toward the legitimate son. It was a fatal error. Agrippina had taught her son too well that power allows for no rivals. Nero, feeling the walls of his own court closing in, remembered the woman from Gaul. He remembered the efficiency with which his stepfather had been removed. The fear that had driven Agrippina to Locusta now drove Nero to her door. This time, however, the summons was not a negotiation. It was a command from a god-king. Locusta was brought before Nero, not in a dungeon, but in the opulence of his private quarters. The young emperor was pacing, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and fury. He needed Britannicus gone. He needed him silenced before he could reach the age of manhood and legally claim his rights. Locusta, understanding the precariousness of her position, prepared a potion. She used the same caution she had with Claudius, a slower, more subtle toxin, designed to look like a natural passing. She delivered it to the palace, and it was administered to Britannicus. But the boy had a strong constitution, or perhaps the dose was too cautious. Britannicus fell ill. His bowels turned to water, but he recovered. He walked the halls again, pale but alive, a living testament to Locusta's failure. The rage of Nero was unlike the cold calculation of his mother. It was a hot, volcanic eruption. He summoned Locusta to the palace, screaming that she had given him a medicine, not a poison, that she was trying to protect his rival. In a fit of hysteria, the Emperor of Rome fell upon her, striking her with his own hands, his rings cutting into her skin. He ordered his guards to flog her right there in the imperial chamber, while he shouted threats of crucifixion and fire. It was the lowest moment of her life since the dungeon. Beaten, bleeding, and humiliated, Locusta realized that caution was no longer a currency she could trade in. Nero did not want the artistry of a natural death. He wanted the certainty of a thunderbolt. He demanded a poison that would kill instantly, swifter than the viper, regardless of how it looked to the public. Under the watchful, manic eyes of the emperor, Locusta set up a makeshift laboratory in the palace itself. She ordered the strongest ingredients, hemlock for paralysis, opium to suppress the breath, and henbane to stop the heart. She did not measure with the care of a healer this time. She measured with the desperation of the condemned. To ensure its potency, Nero demanded a test. A goat was brought into the chamber. Locusta administered the brew. The animal died, but it took 5 hours of agonizing struggle. Nero was displeased. He wanted it faster. Locusta returned to the cauldron. She boiled the mixture down, concentrating the lethal alkaloids, stripping away the unnecessary fluids, until only the black heart of the poison remained. The pig was brought in. This time, upon swallowing the draught, the beast fell dead before it hit the floor. Nero smiled. It was a smile that chilled Locusta to her marrow, for it was the smile of a child who has found a new toy that can break things. He looked at her, his anger forgotten, replaced by a terrifying gratitude. He held the vial of dark liquid to the light, admiring its clarity. "This," he whispered, "is the instrument of peace." The stage was set for the second act of Locusta's service. The feast of Saturnalia was approaching, a time of reversal and chaos. But for Britannicus, it would be the time of eternal silence. The plan was intricate, necessitated by the fact that Britannicus, like all royals, had a food taster. A hot drink would be served, tasted, and deemed safe, but it would be too hot for the boy to drink. He would ask for water to cool it, and in that cold water, pouring from a pitcher that had not been tasted, Locusta's concentrated death would be waiting. The memory of the bubbling cauldron and the dying pig began to fade, the sensory details of the past receding as the cool breeze of the present night brushed against her face once more. The stone floor of her villa felt solid beneath her feet, a stark contrast to the shifting sands of the imperial court. She had survived the dungeon, survived the wrath of Agrippina, and survived the fury of Nero. She had forged her survival in the fires of their ambition. But as she looked out into the darkness of the Italian countryside, she knew that the story of the poisoner does not end with the successful kill. The poison remains in the blood, and the secrets remain in the mind. Nero was pleased for now, but the appetite of a tyrant is a bottomless pit, and she was the only one who knew how to feed it. The shadows stretched long across the estate, pointing like accusing fingers toward the capital, where the boy king played with life and death, and where he would soon call for her again. The stillness of the villa was a deceptive comfort, a fragile veil draped over a history written in venom. As Locusta stood on the cool marble of her terrace, the scent of the Italian cypress trees seemed to twist in the air, transforming into the damp, mouldering stench of the Mamertine prison. The memory pulled her back, not gently but with the heavy iron grip of the past, dragging her from her estate and plunging her once more into the darkness of the year 54. She remembered the cold. It was a cold that did not merely sit upon the skin, but seeped into the marrow, a reminder that she was a woman condemned. In those days, she was not the mistress of estates, but a prisoner, awaiting the executioner's blade. The Roman state had branded her a poisoner, a creature of the shadows to be stamped out, but fate, in its twisted irony, often wears the face of a desperate ruler. The heavy door of her cell had not opened to reveal a guard with a sword, but a messenger with a proposition. Agrippina the Younger, the Empress of Rome, required a particular set of skills that no soldier could provide. The task was momentous, a strike against the very head of the empire. Emperor Claudius, the aging, stuttering ruler, had become an obstacle to Agrippina's ambitions for her son Nero. To remove an emperor is not a matter of brute force, but of delicate, invisible art. Locusta was brought forth from the darkness, her life offered in exchange for a death. She was taken to the Palatine Hill, where the air smelled of roasted meats and perfumed oils, a stark contrast to the rot of the dungeon. There, amidst the whispers of the court, she prepared her masterpiece. It began with a mushroom. The boletus, prized by the Romans for its earthy richness, was the perfect vessel. Locusta selected a specimen that was beautiful to behold, its cap smooth and inviting. With the precision of a jeweler, she infused the dish with a concentrate of aconite and poisonous hemlock, masking the bitterness within the savory sauce. She imagined the scene as she worked. The emperor, known for his gluttonous appetite, reaching for the delicacy, the juices running down his chin, the silence that would follow. But the biology of a man is a stubborn thing, and the constitution of an emperor is often fortified by years of excess. Claudius ate. The poison entered his blood. But death did not come swiftly. He grew ill, his face flushing, his breath hitching, but he did not succumb. Panic rippled through the conspirators. A surviving emperor is a vengeful emperor. Agrippina's eyes, cold and terrified, turned to the physician, Xenophon, and then to the shadow where Locusta waited. It was then that the art of improvisation took hold. As Claudius heaved, struggling to purge his stomach, a feather was called for, a common remedy to induce vomiting, to clear the throat. But this was no ordinary quill. Locusta had anticipated resistance. She had prepared a secondary agent, a toxin of such potency that mere contact with the mucous membranes of the throat would seize the breath forever. She handed the feather to the physician. It was a long, elegant plume, perhaps plucked from a goose that had wandered the temple grounds. In that moment, it was no longer a tool for writing history, but an instrument for ending it. The physician lowered the feather into the emperor's throat. It was a gentle, intimate motion, a mock mercy. The poison painted the lining of his gullet. The heaving stopped. The struggle ceased. The feather had finished what the mushroom began. Claudius slid into the final sleep, and the reign of Nero dawned in a silence broken only by the weeping of those who pretended to mourn. Locusta believed she had bought her freedom with that feather. She imagined a life of quiet obscurity, far from the intrigues of the capital, but she had forgotten the first rule of power. Once you prove yourself useful to a monster, the monster will never let you go. With Claudius dead, the young Nero ascended. At first there was a semblance of peace, but the boy king was paranoid, and his position was not yet secure. His stepbrother Britannicus, the true son of Claudius, remained a living threat, a symbol of the old regime that could rally support against the new. It was not long before the guards came for Locusta again. The reprieve had been an illusion. She was thrown back into the dark, charged with crimes she had committed at the behest of the very people now imprisoning her. This was the nature of Rome. The tool is discarded until it is needed again, and needed she was. Nero, volatile and consumed by jealousy, summoned her from her cell. He did not ask for her help. He demanded it. He wanted Britannicus gone. He wanted the rival voice silenced. Locusta, weary and wary, provided a potion. She crafted it with care, but perhaps with too much caution, fearing that a public death would bring the wrath of the Senate down upon them all. The poison was administered to Britannicus, but it failed. It acted merely as a purgative. The boy fell ill, evacuated his stomach, and recovered. Nero's rage was apoplectic. He did not see caution. He saw incompetence. He saw betrayal. The scene that followed was etched into Locusta's mind like a scar. The Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world, lost all composure. He screamed at her, his face twisted into a mask of petulant fury. But he did not stop at words. In a fit of unbridled violence, Nero seized a whip. He did not call for a lictor to punish her. He did it himself. The lash bit into her skin, a burning reminder of her precarious station. He beat her until his arm tired, screaming that she had given the boy a remedy, not a poison. "Make it faster," he bellowed, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. "Make it instant, like the strike of a viper. If he does not die before his cup hits the table, you will take his place in the tomb." There was no negotiation. There was no defense. There was only the raw, terrifying reality of survival. Locusta was dragged not back to a cell, but to a chamber in the palace that had been converted into a macabre laboratory. Nero demanded a demonstration. He would not trust her word again. This was the birth of her dark university. Under the watchful, manic eyes of the emperor, Locusta set to work. She was given ingredients that would make a legionnaire tremble: concentrated hemlock, opium, powdered arsenic, and the deadly nightshade that grew in the shadows of the tombs. But ingredients were not enough. Nero demanded proof. They brought her animals first. A goat, bleating in confusion, she administered the new mixture, boiled down to a thick, resinous syrup. The animal convulsed and died within minutes. Nero shook his head. "Too slow," he hissed. Next, they brought a pig. A higher dosage. The death was quicker, but still the emperor paced, unsatisfied. He wanted the immediacy of a lightning strike. Finally, the doors opened, and guards dragged in a condemned slave. He was a man whose life had already been forfeited to the state, a nameless vessel for their experiment. Locusta looked into his eyes and saw the reflection of her own desperation. She had no choice. She increased the dosage, combining the rapid onset paralysis of the monk's hood with the cardiac arrest of the foxglove. She offered the cup. The man drank. He took a single breath, his eyes widening, and then collapsed as if the strings holding him upright had been severed by an invisible blade. He was dead before he hit the floor. Nero clapped his hands, a sound like a cracking whip in the silent room. He smiled, a boyish, terrifying expression of delight. "That," he whispered, "that is the drink of a king." The stage was set for the final act of Britannicus. The plan required more than just poison. It required theatre. At the royal banquets, a taster always checked the food and drink of the imperial family. To bypass this, Locusta devised a method of elegant simplicity. The banquet hall was filled with the elite of Rome. Britannicus, just a boy of 14, reclined on his couch. He was served a cup of wine, hot and spiced, as was the custom. The taster drank from it. He remained standing, unharmed. The wine was safe. but it was too hot to drink. Britannicus signalled for it to be cooled. This was the moment. The servant, instructed by Locusta's agents, poured cold water into the cup to temper the heat. The poison was not in the wine, it was in the water. The taster did not check the water. Britannicus raised the cup. He took a long, refreshing draught. The reaction was instantaneous. The mixture, refined in the crucible of Nero's rage and Locusta's terror, slammed into his system. He could not breathe. He could not speak. His limbs seized, his eyes rolled back, and he slumped forward, the cup falling from his hand with a dull clatter that echoed through the sudden silence of the hall. Panic erupted. Guests rose, gasping. Agrippina herself looked struck with horror, realizing the monster her son had become. But Nero, reclining on his couch, did not flinch. He waved a hand dismissively, his voice calm and bored. "Sit," he commanded. "It is merely his epilepsy. He has suffered from falling sickness since childhood. He will recover." But Britannicus did not recover. The life had been snatched from him with the precision of a surgeon. He was carried out, a corpse, while still warm. Yet the poison had one flaw. As the body of Britannicus lay in preparation for the funeral, a strange discoloration began to spread across his skin. The toxins were reacting with the blood, turning the pale flesh into a mottled, bruised black. It was a beacon of unnatural death, a sign that would scream murder to the Roman people. Nero, in his haste, ordered the body to be covered. They brought gypsum white, thick plaster and coated the boy's skin, masking the evidence of the crime under a layer of pale purity. It was a hasty, clumsy concealment born of arrogance. The funeral procession began the very next day. The body was carried through the streets, the gypsum hiding the truth, but the gods, it seemed, were watching. As the procession wound its way toward the Campus Martius, the sky darkened. Thunder rolled like the drums of war, and the heavens opened. It was a torrential downpour, a deluge of biblical proportions. The rain lashed against the mourners, soaking their robes, and it battered the corpse of Britannicus. The water mingled with the gypsum, turning the plaster into a milky slurry that ran off the body in rivulets. Slowly, horribly, the truth was revealed. The white mask dissolved, washing away into the gutters of Rome. Beneath the dissolving facade, the blackened, bruised skin of the poisoned prince was exposed to the eyes of the crowd. The people gasped, pointing at the dark blotches that marred the boy's face. The rain had washed away the lie. Everyone knew. They looked at the body, and then they looked at Nero. The emperor stood stoic in the rain, water dripping from his laurels, indifferent to the exposure. He knew that knowledge without power is meaningless. They knew he was a killer, yes, but they also knew he was the emperor, and standing in the shadows behind him, veiled and silent, was the woman who had distilled the storm into a cup. Locusta watched the gypsum run like tears down the dead boy's face. She felt no triumph, only the cold, hollow certainty of her position. She had succeeded. She had survived the dungeon, the lash, and the test. She had become the right hand of death in a city of wolves. Nero turned to her, a flicker of approval in his eyes, and she knew that the golden cage was closing around her once more. This time, however, the cage would be furnished with unimaginable luxury. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets of Rome, but some stains are too deep to be cleansed by water alone. The era of the University of Poison had begun. Locusta turned away from the procession, her mind already drifting from the dead prince to the living threats that remained. For in the court of Nero, survival was not a destination, but a ceaseless journey through a garden of thorns, where every flower concealed a blade, and every cup held the promise of an eternal sleep. The transition from prisoner to protégé was as swift as the toxins she brewed. The dark cell was replaced by sunlight, but the shadow of her deeds stretched long before her, guiding her steps toward the next chapter of her infamy, where the students would soon arrive to learn the art of the silent kill. To understand the master who now stood at the head of an empire's dark new institution, one must first understand the prisoner who had clawed her way up from the cold, damp earth. The path to this marble villa, with its sprawling gardens of oleander and hemlock, had not been paved with gold, but with the crushed petals of lethal flowers and the silence of the grave. Locusta fingered the small golden box she now carried, at all times a vessel containing a death so swift it was said to sever the soul from the body before the knees hit the floor and let her mind drift back against the current of time. Before she was a legend whispered in fear, she was merely a shadow from the north, a woman whose name meant locust, a creature that consumes. Her story did not begin among the 7 hills of Rome, but in the deep, verdant lungs of Gaul. In those ancient, mist-draped forests, the boundary between medicine and poison was not a wall, but a thin, permeable membrane. Here, she had learned the language of the earth. She was no Roman matron, bound by domestic duties. She was a student of the wild, practicing the old traditions of hedge-witchery that the legions tried so hard to stomp out beneath their hobnailed sandals. As a girl, she had walked the woods where the sun struggled to pierce the canopy, learning that the foxglove which stopped a heart could also steady a racing pulse, and that the belladonna berries, sweet and black as obsidian, held the power to dilate the eyes or close them forever. It was this knowledge, clinical and detached, that she brought with her to the capital. Whether she arrived in chains as a spoil of war, or walked through the gates seeking the coin of the wealthy, history would blur, but the result was the same. Rome was a beast with an insatiable appetite, and Locusta found that its hungers extended beyond grain and wine. There were rivalries to be settled, inheritances to be hastened, and marriages to be dissolved without the messiness of public courts. She became a merchant of silence. But in Rome, a woman with such power is always a threat, and the law, fickle as the wind, eventually closed its jaws around her. This was the era of the forgotten prisoner. Long before Nero's rain-washed procession, Locusta had languished in the dark bowels of the Mamertine prison. The air there was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and ancient terror. She sat in the gloom, a woman condemned to die for the very skills that the elite secretly coveted. She was a curiosity, a poisoner labelled by the state, awaiting the executioner's stranglehold. Days bled into nights in that subterranean hell, where the only measure of time was the dripping of water from the limestone ceiling. She was alone, stripped of her herbs, her vials, and her dignity. It was a place designed to break the spirit, to turn human beings into weeping husks before the final end. But Locusta did not weep. She waited. Her mind was a catalogue of chemical reactions, a library of toxins that no stone walls could imprison. She knew that in a city built on treachery, a talent for death was a currency more valuable than imperial coin. Salvation came not from the gods, but from a woman whose ambition eclipsed even the sun. The year was 54 AD, and the visitor was none other than the Empress herself, Agrippina the Younger. The Empress did not come to the dungeon to offer pity, she came to make a purchase. The target was the Emperor Claudius, a man whose lingering existence had become an inconvenience to Agrippina's plans for her son Nero. The transition from condemned prisoner to imperial agent was instantaneous. Locusta was not freed, but rather repurposed. The damp straw of her cell was exchanged for a secret workspace, a laboratory where she could resume her dark craft under the watchful eyes of the Praetorian Guard. The task was specific, a poison that would mimic natural causes, something that would induce a stupor, allowing the power to transfer seamlessly to the young Nero. Locusta, sensing the fragility of her own life, applied her Gaulish expertise with the precision of a diamond cutter. She chose mushrooms. Claudius was known for his gluttonous appetite, particularly for a dish of savoury fungi. Locusta prepared the toxins, distilling the essence of the deathcap, Amanita phalloides. It was a poison that destroyed the liver, slow and agonizing, but she modified it, blending it with other agents to accelerate the process. She worked with the cold detachment that would come to define her, testing the mixture until she was satisfied with its potency. The night of the banquet was a tableau of Roman excess. Reclining on couches, the most powerful people in the world ate and drank, oblivious to the invisible hand of the Gaulish sorceress hovering over the emperor's plate. Claudius took the bait. He ate the mushrooms with gusto. But the biology of a man is a stubborn thing, and the emperor's constitution was unexpectedly resilient. He did not die immediately. Instead, he fell into a stupor, his body fighting the toxin, retching and groaning. Panic rippled through the conspirators. If Claudius survived, if he woke and realized what had been done, heads would roll, starting with Agrippina's and ending with the forgotten prisoner who had brewed the draught. It was in this moment of crisis that the true nature of Locusta's role was forged. She was not merely a chemist, she was a finisher. As the emperor vomited, trying to purge the poison from his system, his physician complicit in the plot stepped forward under the guise of aiding him. A feather, ostensibly used to tickle the throat and induce further vomiting to clear the stomach, was introduced, but this feather had been dipped in a secondary, far more lethal concentrate prepared by Locusta's hand. It was a masterstroke of improvisation. The feather brushed the back of the emperor's throat, delivering a rapid-acting neurotoxin directly into his mucous membranes. The groans ceased, the breathing slowed. The Emperor of Rome drifted into the final sleep, and the reign of Nero began. One might expect that such a service would earn Locusta her freedom, a villa, and a life of quiet retirement. But in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a loose end is simply a rope waiting to hang you. Following the death of Claudius, Locusta did not find herself in a palace. Instead, the utility of her existence was deemed temporarily exhausted, and the fear of what she knew outweighed the gratitude for what she had done. She was returned to the shadows. This was the cruelest irony of her existence, and the fuel that hardened her heart into the stone it had become. The forgotten prisoner was not a one-time title, it was a recurring nightmare. She was thrown back into chains, accused of the very crimes she had committed at the behest of the throne. It was a political maneuver, a way to distance the new regime from the murder of the old. For months she sat in the darkness once more, the taste of betrayal bitter on her tongue. She realized then that there was no loyalty among wolves. She was a tool, like a dagger or a chalice, to be used and then cast aside until the next hunger arose. It was during this second imprisonment that the fear truly took root, not the fear of death, for she walked hand in hand with the Reaper daily, but the fear of powerlessness. She swore to herself in the silence of her cell that if she ever emerged again, she would make herself indispensable. She would become so terrifying, so efficient, that no emperor could afford to lock her away. She would not just be a poisoner, she would be an institution. And the call did come. It came when the young Nero, now growing into his own tyranny, found himself chafing against the presence of his stepbrother, Britannicus. The boy was a rival, a legitimate heir whose existence threatened Nero's absolute rule. The emperor remembered the woman from Gaul, the one his mother had used. He remembered the efficiency of the mushroom and the feather. But this time, the summons was different. Nero did not send a polite messenger. He sent guards to drag her from her cell to the Palatine Hill. The scene that followed was burned into Locusta's memory, a trauma that lay beneath her calm exterior like a submerged jagged rock. The first attempt on Britannicus had failed. Locusta, cautious after her previous betrayal, had provided a weaker dose, hoping to avoid immediate suspicion, perhaps trying to play a longer game. The poison had only acted as a laxative, causing the boy embarrassment, but no real harm. Nero was apoplectic. He was not a man of patience. He saw the failure not as caution, but as incompetence or worse, treachery. In a fit of rage that would become legendary, the Emperor of Rome fell upon the poisoner with his own hands. He flogged her, his face twisted into a mask of petulant fury, screaming that she was trying to protect his enemies. He threatened her with immediate execution, describing in graphic detail the horrors that awaited her if she did not produce a toxin that killed as instantly as the sword. There, on the floor of the imperial palace, bleeding and humiliated, Locusta looked up at the boy king. She saw the madness in his eyes, but she also saw his desperate need. He could not kill Britannicus with a blade. It had to be a natural death, a sudden seizure at the dinner table. He needed her, and in that moment of pain and clarity, the final transformation occurred. The survivalist instinct of the Gaulish forests merged with the cold calculation of the Roman court. She rose from the floor, wiping the blood from her lip. She did not beg, she did not cry. She simply nodded. She demanded a cauldron to be set up in the emperor's own chambers, refusing to leave his sight until the deed was prepared. There, under the watchful, manic gaze of Nero, she brewed the concoction that would end the life of Britannicus and secure her own ascent. She tested it on a goat. The animal died in 5 hours. Too slow. She boiled it down, refined it, concentrated the aconite and hemlock. She tested it on a pig. The beast fell dead before it could finish a single breath. Nero clapped his hands in delight, the flogging forgotten, the bond between monster and maker sealed. This was the potion that would be used in the clever trick with the cold water, the one that had just claimed the prince and washed the gypsum-covered body in the rain. Standing now in her new estate, Locusta exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for years. The rain outside tapped against the marble columns, a gentle rhythm compared to the dripping of the dungeon. She was no longer the forgotten prisoner. She was Locusta, the imperial poisoner, the mistress of the golden box. She had students arriving tomorrow, men and women sent by the state to learn the botany of death. She would teach them well. She would teach them that the most dangerous poison was not in the plant, but in the heart of the one who ordered the brew. The memories receded, slipping back into the dark corners of her mind. She turned away from the window, placing the golden box on a velvet table. The past was a prison she had escaped, but the future was a labyrinth she had to build. And as the sun began to set over the wet rooftops of Rome, casting long, blood-red shadows across her floor, she prepared for her first lesson. The curriculum would be simple. Survival is the only virtue, and silence is the only law. The heavy oak doors of her chamber creaked open, and the first of her pupils hesitated on the threshold, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. Locusta smoothed the folds of her stola, her face composed into a mask of serene authority. The lesson was about to begin. The young man standing in the doorway was trembling. It was a subtle vibration, barely visible to the untrained eye, manifesting only in the way his fingers curled tightly against the fabric of his tunic and the rapid, shallow rise of his chest. Locusta watched him from across the room, her silhouette framed by the dying light of the window. She recognized that tremble. It was not merely the nervousness of a student meeting a master. It was the primal, cold-blooded shivering of a prey animal that has stepped into the den of a predator. She did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch between them like a taut wire, testing the boy's resolve. In his fear, she saw a reflection of her own past, a ghost of the terror that had once nearly consumed her in the marble halls of the Palatine Hill. She motioned for him to enter, her gesture fluid and commanding, but her mind drifted backward, pulled by the gravity of memory to a time when she had not been the mistress of an estate, but a desperate woman on her knees, staring at the sandals of a teenage tyrant. The fear this boy felt was a pale imitation of the terror she had known under the shadow of Nero. It had been only a year prior, shortly after the death of Claudius. The transition of power had been smooth on the surface, orchestrated by the iron will of the Empress Agrippina, but beneath the gilded veneer of Rome, the currents of paranoia ran deep. Nero, the new emperor, was young, volatile, and consumed by a jealousy that bordered on madness. His target was Britannicus, his stepbrother and the biological son of the late Claudius. Britannicus was nearly 14, approaching manhood, and every breath he took was a reminder to Nero that a legitimate heir to the bloodline still walked the earth. Locusta remembered the summons. It had not been a polite invitation. Praetorian guards had dragged her from her cell, the smell of damp stone clinging to her skin, and brought her before the emperor. He did not want a slow decline for his brother. He wanted an immediate cessation of life. She had prepared a brew, a mixture of hemlock and opium she believed would stop the heart quietly, masking the death as a natural seizure. But she had been cautious, too cautious. The memory of her failure was etched into her skin. She could still feel the phantom sting of the lash. The poison she had provided for the first attempt had been too weak. Britannicus had fallen ill, his stomach rebelling, but his constitution was stronger than she had anticipated. He had purged the toxin and survived. When word reached Nero that his rival still lived, his rage was not the calculated anger of a statesman, but the petulant, unchecked fury of a god-child. He had summoned Locusta to his private chambers, not to negotiate, but to punish. She remembered the smell of that room frankincense masking the metallic scent of sweat and fear. Nero had not delegated the punishment. In a fit of manic energy, he had struck her himself. His face twisted into a mask of frustration, screaming that she had given him a remedy for the bowels rather than a weapon of death. He accused her of guarding herself, of diluting the dose to avoid the charge of treason, playing both sides to ensure her own survival. As she lay on the mosaic floor, the cold tiles pressing against her cheek, he had given her an ultimatum that sharpened her mind like a whetstone. There would be no prison cell if she failed again. There would be only a public execution, slow and agonizing. He demanded a poison that was instant. He wanted a toxin that would strike like lightning, something that would bypass the slow decay of illness and deliver immediate oblivion. She was confined to a room adjacent to the emperor's quarters, a makeshift laboratory guarded by stone-faced sentries who watched her every move. The pressure was suffocating. She worked with a frantic, terrible precision, her hands moving among the jars and dried bundles of herbs with the speed of a weaver at the loom. She abandoned caution. She reached for the aconite, the plant the ancients called the queen of poisons, and distilled it to a potency she had never dared before. She mixed it with water hemlock and other darker, nameless roots gathered from the deep woods of Gaul, boiling the concoction until it reduced to a thick, resinous syrup. But she could not rely on theory. Nero demanded proof. The memory turned darker, shifting to the bleating of a goat brought into her chambers. She had forced the liquid down the animal's throat. It died within minutes, a convulsing heap of fur and panicked breath. Nero watched, unimpressed. "Too slow," he had whispered, his eyes glinting with a morbid scientific curiosity. "It must be faster." She returned to the fire. She distilled the essence again, concentrating the death, removing every impurity that might slow the absorption into the blood. The next test subject was a pig. The creature fell dead the moment the liquid touched its tongue, as if struck by an invisible hammer. Only then did Nero smile. It was a smile devoid of warmth, a baring of teeth that signaled approval of the weapon, not the maker. The delivery of the poison required a theatre of its own. Britannicus was surrounded by protections that rivaled the gods. He ate at the imperial table, but every morsel of food and every drop of wine was tested by a praegastator, a servant whose sole purpose was to die in his master's place. To poison the prince, one had to outwit the taster. Locusta had devised the method, whispering the instructions to Nero's trusted agents. It was a plan of elegant simplicity, exploiting the very etiquette of the Roman dinner table. The banquet hall was filled with the elite of Rome, a sea of white togas and glittering gold. Locusta was not present in the hall. She waited in the shadows of the servants' corridors, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation, waiting for the silence that would signal her success. Britannicus was served a cup of wine. The taster drank from it, waited, and finding no ill effect, handed the cup to the prince. But the wine had been heated, made deliberately too hot to drink, a common preference for some, but in this case exaggerated. Britannicus, feeling the heat against his lips, recoiled and asked for water to cool it. This was the moment. The poison was not in the wine, it was in the cold water brought in a separate pitcher. Since water was not considered a dish in itself, the taster did not check it. The servant poured the cold, clear liquid into the hot wine. Britannicus raised the cup, drank deep, and the trap snapped shut. He did not cry out. He did not clutch his throat in a theatrical display. The toxin, refined in Locusta's cauldron of fear, acted instantly. His voice failed him in mid-sentence. His eyes rolled back, and his limbs went rigid. He slid from his couch, crashing to the floor with the heavy, dull thud of a lifeless body. The banquet hall erupted in gasps. Guests recoiled. Cups were dropped, spilling red wine across the tables like premature blood. But on the central couch, Nero remained reclining, utterly still. He looked at the body of his brother with a bored, languid expression. When the guests looked to the emperor in horror, he merely waved a hand, dismissing their panic. He has always been subject to the falling sickness. Nero lied, his voice calm and carrying easily over the murmurs. The seizure will pass. His senses will return. But they did not return. Britannicus was dead before he hit the floor. The falling sickness, epilepsy, was a convenient shroud, a lie that everyone in the room accepted, because to challenge it was to invite their own death. Locusta, listening from the shadows, let out a breath. She felt she had been holding for days. She had survived. By becoming the hand of death, she had secured her own life. Yet the gods of the dead do not relinquish their claims easily. There was a final grotesque chapter to the murder that haunted her dreams more than the act itself. The poison, so concentrated and violent, had an unforeseen effect on the prince's physiology. As the preparations for the funeral began rushed, to hide the evidence, the skin of the corpse began to change. The toxin had ruptured the capillaries and blackened the flesh. Britannicus, pale in life, turned a mottled, bruised violet black in death, an undeniable sign of poisoning that no physician could explain away as a natural seizure. Panic seized the palace. If the public saw the blackened face of the popular young prince, there would be riots. The Praetorian Guard would turn. Nero's agents, acting on Locusta's frantic advice, covered the body in gypsum, a thick white plaster used to mask the discoloration. They painted his face with the semblance of life, hiding the bruising under a mask of chalk and wax. It was a hasty, desperate concealment. The funeral procession moved through the forum, the body carried on an open bier for the people to mourn. The sky, which had been heavy and grey all morning, broke open. It was as if Jupiter himself looked down in disgust at the deception. A torrential rainstorm swept over Rome, a deluge of water that lashed against the stone streets and the mourners alike. The rain beat down upon the corpse of Britannicus. The water soaked into the gypsum, turning the plaster to sludge. Slowly, horrifyingly, the white mask began to melt away. As the procession marched on, the rain washed the lies from the prince's face, revealing the blackened, poisoned skin beneath. To the thousands of Roman citizens lining the streets, they saw the truth. They saw the mark of the poisoner. They saw the wrath of Nero. But fear is a powerful silencer. The people saw, and they looked away. They understood then that a new era had begun, an era where the emperor could kill his own blood in plain sight, and the very elements could reveal his crime. Yet no man would dare to speak a word of justice. Locusta turned back from the window, the memory of the rain-streaked, blackened face fading back into the recesses of her mind. That was the day she learned the true nature of power. Power was not just the ability to kill. It was the ability to stand amidst the evidence of one's crimes and force the world to pretend they saw nothing. She looked at the student again. He had stopped trembling, though his eyes remained wary. He was waiting for her to speak, to begin the instruction. He did not know that the true lesson was not about roots or berries. It was about the gypsum and the rain. It was about the inevitable failure of secrets and the necessity of absolute, terrifying competence. She walked slowly to the heavy wooden table in the center of the room, her hand trailing over the cool surface of a clay jar. "You are afraid," she said, her voice low, resonating with a calm that filled the stone chamber. "That is good. Fear sharpens the senses. Arrogance dulls them. The man who has no fear is already dead. He simply hasn't finished falling yet." She uncorked the jar, the scent of bitter almonds drifting into the air, sweet, cloying, and dangerous. "You have come to learn how to end a life," she continued, pouring a small amount of clear liquid into a shallow bowl. "But before you can learn to stop a heart, you must understand what drives it. You think you are here to study botany, to memorize which leaf stops the breath and which root burns the stomach?" She looked up, locking eyes with him. "Botany is for gardeners. You are here to learn the architecture of necessity. The emperor does not ask for a plant, he asks for a result, and if you fail to provide it, you become the result yourself." She gestured to the golden box that sat on the velvet cloth near the window, the box containing Nero's own fail-safe, the poison she had brewed for him to keep close against his own chest. "I exist because I am useful," she whispered, "and you will only leave this room if you can prove that you are more dangerous to the emperor's enemies than you are to the emperor himself." She pushed the bowl across the table toward the young man. "Smell this," she commanded, "and tell me, does it smell like death, or does it smell like mercy?" The student stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the floor, merging with hers. The lesson had begun, and the ghosts of the past Britannicus, the pig, the goat, stood in unseen attendance, silent witnesses to the curriculum of survival. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the room into twilight, and in the gathering dark, Locusta began to... The student leaned over the bowl, his nostrils flaring slightly as he sought a trace of bitterness, a hint of almond, or the cloying sweetness of rot. He found nothing. The liquid was as clear as spring water, as innocent as the morning dew that gathers on the petals of a lily. He looked up, confusion clouding his eyes, waiting for approval. "It smells of nothing," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper in the stone room. "Precisely," Locusta replied, her voice drifting like smoke through the dim air. "If death had a scent, kings would never eat. If it had a taste, emperors would never drink. The art is not in the killing, boy. The art is in the silence." She turned away from him, her gaze drifting toward the heavy curtains that obscured the view of the Roman hills. Her mind, however, did not rest on the rolling landscape or the sprawling estates that Nero had gifted her. It travelled back to a time before she was the mistress of this dark school, back to the moment when she learned that the only thing more dangerous than being a prisoner was being a disappointment to a Caesar. It was the year 55. The air in Rome had been thick with tension, a heavy blanket of humidity and paranoia that made the marble pillars of the Palatine Hill sweat. Claudius was dead, and the young Nero sat upon the throne, but his seat was not yet comfortable. Shadows lingered in the corners of the palace, and the longest shadow of all was cast by a boy of 14 years, Britannicus, the rightful son of the dead emperor, the stepbrother whose mere existence threatened to unmake Nero's reign. Locusta remembered the summons. It had not been a polite invitation to court. Soldiers had come for her in the dead of night, dragging her from the temporary comfort of her quarters. They brought her not to a dungeon, but to the emperor's private chambers, where the air smelled of expensive oil and unchecked rage. She had failed him. That was the accusation. Days prior, she had provided a mixture intended to silence Britannicus forever. She had crafted it with care, using the same knowledge that had dispatched Claudius. But she had been cautious, too cautious. She had tempered the wolfsbane with sedatives, fearing that a violent death would draw too much suspicion to the new regime. The result had been catastrophic in its mildness. Britannicus had eaten the poisoned food, turned pale, and suffered a loosening of the bowels. But he had lived. He had risen the next morning, weak but breathing, a living testament to Locusta's hesitation. Nero did not tolerate hesitation. Standing before him in that opulent room, Locusta saw the monster peeling away the skin of the boy. He was not the artist or the poet then. He was a creature of violent impulse. He screamed at her, his voice cracking with the indignity of it all, accusing her of fearing the Julian laws against poisoning, of valuing her own safety over his security. "You gave him a remedy," Nero had shouted, his face flushed a mottled purple. "You gave him a tonic to strengthen his gut, not a weapon to end his life." Then came the pain. It was a lesson Locusta would never forget, etched into her memory as deeply as it was etched into her skin. The Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the known world, did not call for a lictor or a guard to punish her. He descended from his couch and struck her himself. His hands, usually reserved for holding a lyre or a goblet, were heavy and brutal. He flogged her there in the chamber, the sound of the blows echoing against the frescoes of gods and heroes who looked on in painted silence. He beat her until the floor was stained, and then he stood over her, breathless and wild-eyed. "Make it faster," he hissed, the threat hanging heavy in the air. "Make it instant, or the next execution will be yours, and it will not be swift." Driven by the primal clarity of terror, Locusta returned to her workroom. This was not a classroom then, it was a forge of necessity. She ordered a brazier to be brought directly into the emperor's quarters, refusing to leave his sight. Proving her devotion through the alchemy of death, she worked with a feverish intensity, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the vibration of pure focus. She abandoned caution. There would be no sedatives to mask the pain, no dilution to mimic natural illness. She reached for the purest distillations of aconite, the essence of the monkshood plant, known to the ancients as the queen of poisons. She combined it with the dark, resinous tears of opium, not to soothe, but to suppress the body's ability to reject the toxin. She boiled the mixture down, reducing it until it was a thick, obsidian syrup. Her concentration of malice, so potent it seemed to absorb the light around it. But she could not afford another failure. Nero watched her, his eyes cold and unblinking, like a reptile sunning itself on a rock. She called for a test subject. A young goat was brought in, bleating softly. She forced the liquid down its throat. The animal staggered, its legs stiffening, and it collapsed. It died within 5 hours. Nero scoffed. "Too slow," he muttered, turning away. "He will cry out. He will name me. 5 hours is an eternity." Locusta felt the cold breath of the grave on her neck. She returned to the brazier. She added hemlock for paralysis, and crushed seeds of Nox vomica, which she had traded from merchants travelling from the Far East. She distilled the mixture again, refining it, stripping away the impurities until only the kill remained. A wild boar was dragged into the room. It was a beast of strength and fury, thrashing against its bonds. Locusta approached it, the new draught held in a silver spoon. She poured it into the beast's maw. Before the spoon had even clattered to the floor, the boar convulsed. A single, violent shudder passed through its massive frame, and then it was still, instant, immediate. It was as if the life had been severed from the body with a blade. Nero smiled. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile that promised safety only as long as she was useful. "Good," he whispered. Tonight, the banquet. The banquet of ice, as Locusta would come to call it in the quiet recesses of her mind, took place in the grand triclinium of the palace. The atmosphere was one of forced conviviality. Senators, nobles, and the imperial family reclined on couches upholstered in Tyrian purple. Lamps burned with scented oils, casting a golden haze over the tables laden with roasted meats, exotic fruits, and flagons of Falernian wine. Locusta was not at the table, of course. She was a shadow in the periphery, watching from the service corridors, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched Britannicus. He was a boy on the cusp of manhood, sitting near his stepbrother, unaware that he was the guest of honor at his own funeral. The problem, Locusta knew, was the taster. Britannicus was guarded. Every dish, every cup that touched his lips was first sampled by a praegustator, a servant whose sole purpose was to die in his master's place. To poison the wine directly would be to kill the servant and warn the master. But Locusta had studied the habits of the court. She knew the rhythm of the meal. She knew that the Romans preferred their wine warm and spiced, but diluted with water. The moment arrived. A servant approached Britannicus with a goblet of hot, spiced wine. The taster stepped forward, took the cup, and drank a deep draught. The court watched. The taster swallowed. He remained standing, healthy, unaffected. The wine was safe. He handed the cup to Britannicus. The young prince took it, the heat radiating into his palms. He brought it to his lips and frowned. "It is too hot," he complained, his voice carrying over the low hum of conversation. This was the trap. This was the genius of the Gaulish witch. "Cool it," the prince commanded. A servant, instructed beforehand, stepped forward with a pitcher of cold water. This water had not been tasted. Why would it be? It was merely water, clear and innocent. But in that pitcher, dissolved into the chill liquid, was the concentration of death Locusta had brewed in the emperor's chambers. The servant poured the cold water into the hot wine. The fluids mixed, the poison swirling invisible into the safe drink. Britannicus raised the cup again. He drank deeply, thirsty from the rich food and the heat of the room. The effect was terrifying in its speed. The cup fell from his hand, clattering loudly against the marble floor, spilling a red stain that looked too much like blood. Britannicus did not scream. He could not. His throat seized instantly, the muscles locking in a rigid paralysis. He fell backward on his couch, his eyes rolling back into his head, his body arching in a silent, grotesque spasm. The breath was stolen from his lungs before he could even understand that he was dying. The dining hall erupted into chaos. Agrippina, the empress mother, leaped to her feet, her face draining of all colour. She knew, in that instant, looking at the convulsing body of her stepson, and then at the impassive face of her own son, she knew that the tiger she had raised had finally unsheathed its claws. But Nero did not rise. He remained on his couch, reclining with the casual indifference of a god-watching mortal's suffer. He picked up a fig and examined it. "Be calm," the emperor said, his voice cutting through the panic. "It is merely the falling sickness. He has suffered from these fits since childhood. His sight and senses will return in a moment." He lied with the same ease that he breathed. The guests, terrified and confused, slowly lowered themselves back onto their couches. They forced themselves to eat, to drink, to smile, all while the boy on the couch next to them gasped his last silent breath and went still. Britannicus was dead before the main course was cleared. Locusta, watching from the shadows, felt the tension leave her body, replaced by a cold, heavy stone of realization. She had succeeded. She had bought her life with the death of a boy. But the poison was potent, perhaps too potent. As the body began to cool, a new problem arose. The toxin, violent and corrosive, began to stain the prince's skin. The pale marble complexion of the Julian line turned a mottled, bruised black. It spread across his face and neck, the undeniable mark of unnatural death. No physician could call this epilepsy. No lie could cover this discoloration. Nero ordered the funeral to take place immediately, that very night. He could not risk a public viewing. But the skin was a confession. Locusta was summoned to the preparation room. The body lay on a slab, dark and twisted. "Fix it," the agents of the emperor commanded. She ordered gypsum white plaster, chalky and thick. They painted the corpse of Britannicus, covering the black bruises with a layer of artificial whiteness. They masked the evidence of the crime with the makeup of the tomb, sculpting a mask of peace over the face of agony. The procession began under the cover of darkness, winding its way toward the Campus Martius. But the gods, it seemed, were not as easily silenced as the court. As the funeral train moved through the streets, the sky opened up. A torrential rain began to fall, a deluge of biblical proportions. The water lashed against the body of the prince. It soaked the funeral robes and ran in rivulets down his face, and as the rain fell, it washed away the gypsum. The white plaster dissolved, streaming off the body like tears, revealing the blackened, poisoned skin beneath. The people in the streets saw it. The rumors flew faster than the wind. They whispered that the heavens themselves were weeping for the boy, washing away the lies of the emperor to show the truth of the murder. It did not matter. Nero was emperor. The truth was what he said it was, and though the people whispered, they did so with their heads bowed, fear keeping their voices low. For Locusta, the reign was a cleansing of a different sort. Nero, delighted by the swiftness of the death, regardless of the funeral mishap, kept his word. He did not execute her. He did not cast her back into the dungeon. Instead, he pardoned her. He declared her a free woman. He bestowed upon her vast estates in the countryside, lands where she could grow her herbs in peace, and, with a twisted sense of imperial gratitude, he sent her pupils young men and women from the court, eager to learn the dark arts. He legitimized her craft, turning the prison rat into the head mistress of a university of poison. Locusta blinked, the memory of the rain fading, replaced by the dry, still air of her classroom. The student was still watching her, the bowl of clear liquid between them. The silence, Locusta repeated, her voice steady. That is what you must master. The gypsum may wash away, and the truth may show its face, but if the work is done, the consequences are for the historians, not for us. She reached out and took the bowl from the student's hands. She walked to the window, where the last light of day was bleeding out of the sky. But there are some poisons, she said, turning back to the class, her silhouette framed by the dying sun, that do not kill the body. They kill the will. They kill the spirit. And for those we do not need hemlock or aconite. She moved toward a heavy wooden cabinet at the back of the room, the hinges groaning softly as she pulled it open. Inside, rows of dried fungi and strange desiccated roots hung like shrunken trophies. Tonight, she murmured, we leave the realm of instant death and enter the world of the slow decay, the madness of the mind. She selected a jar filled with a powder as yellow as sulphur. Tell me, she asked the gathered students, what you know of the root that makes men see gods where there are none. The silence that followed her question was heavy, filled only by the soft hissing of the oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows against the stone walls of the chamber. The students, a hand-picked cadre of shadowed figures, did not speak. They watched her hands, mesmerized by the delicate way she held the jar of yellow powder, as if it were a fragile bird that might take flight at any moment. Locusta did not wait for an answer. She turned the jar slowly, watching the grains tumble against the glass. It is a root from the north, she continued, her voice dropping to a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate in the cool air, from the deep, moss-choked forests where the sun struggles to pierce the canopy. It is a place I once knew, long before these stone walls became my world. Her mind drifted back, pulling the narrative of the lesson into the tapestry of her own history. To understand the poison, one had to understand the earth from which it sprang. She spoke of Gaul, not as a province on a map, but as a sensory landscape of damp earth and ancient oaks. She had not been born a monster in the eyes of Rome. She had been born a daughter of the wild, raised in the traditions of the Romans called hedge-witchery, but which her people knew as the dialogue between nature and survival. In those northern woods there was no distinction between the cure and the curse. The same aconite that could stop a heart could, in the smallest measure, ease the trembling of a fever. The belladonna that widened the eyes of a lover could also close them forever. She had learned these truths in the quiet solitude of the forest, gathering herbs by the light of the moon, her fingers stained with the green blood of plants. It was a time of innocence, though the knowledge she gathered was heavy with potential violence. When she came to Rome, that knowledge became her currency, and then her cage. The transition from the open air of Gaul to the suffocating intrigue of the capital was stark. She described to her silent audience how the city of marble and gold was built upon a foundation of secrets, and how she, a foreigner with the power over life and death in her satchel, became a necessary shadow in the bright light of the empire. You see, she murmured, placing the yellow jar back onto the shelf and selecting a dried, withered mushroom. Talent in Rome is a dangerous thing. It draws the eye of power, And when the eye of power falls upon you, you have two choices: serve or perish. She recounted the year 54 AD, a time when the air in Rome was thick with trepidation. She had been languishing in a cell, the damp stone pressing against her back, awaiting execution for the crime of doing what she did best. The smell of the prison was a mixture of rot and fear, a scent she could never fully scrub from her memory. But the executioner did not come. Instead, a messenger arrived, bearing the seal of the Empress Agrippina. The students leaned forward. This was the lesson they craved, not just the botany, but the application of history. Locusta described the commission with a detached, clinical precision. The target was the Emperor Claudius. The weapon was to be a dish of mushrooms, his favorite delicacy. She spoke of the preparation, the way she had infused the succulent bolites with a concentrate of toxins so potent it should have stopped a bull in its tracks. She described the banquet, the noise, the wine flowing like a river, and the tension that tightened her chest as she waited for the news. But the emperor was strong, or perhaps the wine had diluted the dose. He sickened, yes, but he did not die. He groaned, his body fighting the foreign invader, and for a moment Locusta's own life hung in the balance. If he survived, her head would roll. Perfection, she told the class, holding the dried mushroom up to the lamplight, is rarely achieved in the first stroke. One must always be ready with the second. She told them of the feather. It was a tool of mercy, ostensibly a physician's instrument used to tickle the throat and induce vomiting to purge the stomach. But in the hands of her agents, guided by her chemistry, the feather was painted with a second, faster poison. When it touched the emperor's throat to help him, it instead sealed his fate. The irony was a flavor she still savored. The very act of trying to save himself was the mechanism of his end. The room remained silent, the students absorbing the weight of regicide. But the lesson was not over. The death of Claudius was merely the prologue to the true era of her craft. New masters bring new demands, she said, her voice hardening slightly, and the young wolf is often hungrier than the old lion. Nero had ascended. The boy emperor, with his artistic soul and his capricious cruelty, brought Locusta out of the shadows and into the blinding center of his court. But favor is a pendulum. When Nero demanded the death of his stepbrother, Britannicus, the pressure was no longer just professional, it was existential. She moved away from the cabinet, pacing the stone floor. She spoke of the first attempt on Britannicus, a failure that resulted only in a weakness of the bowels for the young rival. She did not hide the consequences of that failure. She described the fury of Nero, a rage that was physically manifested. She told them of the flogging, the lash, biting into her skin, the emperor himself standing over her, shouting that she was a fraud, a charlatan, a peddler of weak potions. Pain, she said softly, is an excellent clarifier of the mind. It strips away hesitation. It demands excellence. Under the threat of immediate execution, she had returned to her cauldrons. This was the birth of the university in its truest form, not a school of leisure, but a crucible of survival. She described the feverish days that followed, the smoke filling her laboratory as she boiled and distilled, seeking a toxin that was faster than fire, swifter than the viper's strike. She did not shy away from the darker truths of her research. She spoke of the animals brought to her, the pigs, the goats, and the cold scientific observation of their deaths. She noted the timing, the convulsions, the precise moment the heart ceased to beat. When the animals proved the poison was strong, but the dosage for a human remained theoretical, the tests moved to slaves. It was a confession delivered without tremor. In the logic of the empire, some lives were fuel for the preservation of others. We required a method, she explained, that could bypass the taster, a poison that could hide in plain sight. The solution was a masterpiece of thermal dynamics and social engineering. At the banquet, a drink was served to Britannicus hot, aromatic wine. It was tested by the official taster and found pure, but it was too hot to drink. Britannicus, as expected, asked for water to cool it. The poison, Locusta said, her eyes gleaming in the low light, was not in the wine. It was in the cold water. The water, poured from a pitcher that had not been tasted, mingled with the wine. Britannicus drank. He did not cry out. He simply ceased to breathe, his voice cut off in mid-sentence, his limbs seizing. The court froze. Nero, reclining on his couch, casually remarked that his brother was merely having an epileptic fit, a condition he had known since childhood. But Locusta knew, and the students knew, that it was the work of the master. She paused, allowing the image of the dying prince to settle in the minds of her listeners. But there was one final detail, a lesson in the unpredictability of nature that no alchemist could fully control. "We paint our crimes," she whispered, "but the gods have their own reign." Britannicus's body, saturated with the toxin she had brewed, began to change. The skin, reacting to the arsenic and belladonna, turned a dark, bruised violet, a telltale sign of poisoning that no physician could ignore. To hide this, Nero ordered the body covered in gypsum, a white plaster that gave the corpse the pallor of natural death. It was a clever mask, but during the funeral procession, as the body was carried through the streets of Rome, the skies turned black. A torrential storm broke over the city, a deluge of biblical proportions. The rain lashed against the corpse, dissolving the gypsum, washing away the white lye. Beneath the melting plaster, the dark-stained face of Britannicus was revealed to the horror of the crowd. The crime was exposed by the elements themselves. "Remember this," she said, facing the window where the night sky was now fully black. "You can fool the eyes of men, but the earth remembers its own. The elements will always seek the truth." Despite the public revelation, Nero's power was absolute. He did not punish her for the rain. He rewarded her for the silence of his rival. He gave her estates in the country, vast lands where she could grow her gardens of death in peace. He sent her pupils, these very students, or their predecessors, to learn the art of toxicology. She became a professor of the dark arts, state-sponsored and untouchable. She walked back to the table, where a small, golden box sat gleaming under the lamp. She picked it up, weighing it in her palm. "Trust is a rare commodity," she murmured. "The emperor trusts no one. Not his guards, not his wife, not his mother. He trusts only this." She opened the box to reveal a small vial of clear liquid. It was her magnum opus, a poison so distilled, so potent, that it offered a doorway out of this world that opened in the blink of an eye. Nero kept it with him always, a talisman against capture, a guarantee that he would never suffer the indignity of a public execution. He carried her work against his own heart, a final escape route forged by her hands. Locusta closed the box with a sharp click that echoed in the stone room. She looked at the faces of her students, seeing the mixture of awe and terror that she had once felt in the presence of the Druids. "We are not merely killers," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to merge with the shadows. "We are the architects of history's abrupt turns. We are the silence at the end of the feast. We are the cold water in the hot wine." She moved to the side of the room, her hand resting on the heavy latch of the door that led to the inner sanctum of her laboratory, where the fires were always burning and the air always smelled of bitter almonds and sweet decay. "But to understand the end," she said, pushing the door open to reveal the flickering orange glow of the furnace beyond, "one must first understand the suffering that precedes it. Tonight we do not study the quick death. Tonight we study the lingering ghost." She beckoned them forward, into the heat and the smoke. "Come," she breathed. "The night is young, and the fire is hungry." The heavy wooden door groaned as it closed behind the students, sealing them inside the sanctum where the air was thick with heat and the copper taste of magic. The furnace roared softly, a captive beast in the corner of the room, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough stone walls. Here, the scent of the wild forests of Gaul seemed to linger, a ghostly memory of pine and damp earth that Locusta had carried with her across the Alps, all the way to the marble heart of Rome. But beneath that, earthy nostalgia, lay the sharper metallic tang of minerals and the cloying sweetness of belladonna, the perfume of death, distilled into art. She moved among the tables with the grace of a priestess in a temple, her fingers trailing over clay pots and glass vials that caught the firelight. The students watched her, their breathing shallow, their eyes wide. They were in the presence of a legend, a woman who had risen from the straw of a dungeon floor to the velvet couches of the Palatine Hill. To them, she was a master. To herself, she was a survivor who had learned that in Rome, power was not seized with a sword, but poured from a vial. She picked up a dried root, turning it over in her hands. Its surface gnarled and pale like an old man's finger. To serve the throne, she began, her voice weaving through the hum of the fire, is to live with a knife at your own throat. You must be sharper than the blade. You must be faster than the suspicion. Her mind drifted back, pulling the students with her into the tapestry of the past, to the year when her life had hung by a thread, or rather, by a feather. It was the year 54. The Emperor Claudius, a man of great appetite and faltering wits, sat upon the world's highest seat. Locusta remembered the damp chill of the Mamertine prison where she had waited for the executioner, her knowledge of roots and berries deemed a crime against the state. But fate, she told the silent room, often arrives in the guise of a desperate woman. Agrippina the Younger, the empress with eyes like polished flint, had come to her not with judgment, but with a commission. She needed the old emperor gone to make way for her son, Nero. Locusta had not hesitated. She recalled the dish she had prepared, a stew of succulent mushrooms, the emperor's favorite. Into the sauce, she had folded the essence of the death cap, a fungus that mimics the savory richness of the meal until it is too late. But nature is stubborn, she murmured to the students, placing the dried root back on the table, and the bodies of old men are unpredictable. Claudius had eaten. He had gasped. But the poison, perhaps diluted by wine or an excess of food, had only sickened him. Chaos had erupted in the dining hall. Panic is the poisoner's enemy, for in panic, doctors are summoned, and stomachs are purged. Locusta had watched from the shadows as the physician Xenophon, ostensibly loyal to the empress but terrified of the outcome, approached the groaning emperor. It was then that the true art was revealed. It was not enough to merely administer the toxin, one had to ensure its completion. Locusta had prepared for this failure. She had handed the physician a feather, dipped not in water to tickle the throat and induce vomiting, but soaked in a concentrate of blistering toxicity. Under the guise of mercy, under the pretense of aiding the emperor's relief, the final blow was struck. The feather brushed the back of the throat, and the throat closed forever. Adaptability, she said, looking at the young faces illuminated by the orange glow. The plan is a ghost. The moment is flesh. You must be ready to kill with a kindness, with a feather, with a touch. But the favor of princes is as volatile as mercury. The transition of power from Claudius to Nero brought Locusta out of the shadows and into a new, terrifying light. The young Nero, vain and fearful, looked at his stepbrother Britannicus with the paranoia that infects all who wear the purple. Britannicus was the blood son of Claudius, a legitimate heir, a threat that breathed and walked the halls of the palace. Locusta's expression hardened as the memory shifted. The fire in the furnace seemed to flare, mirroring the rage of the young emperor. She remembered the lashes. Nero was not a man of patience. When her first attempt to remove Britannicus failed, the boy, merely suffering a bout of diarrhea that passed by morning, Nero had not accepted excuses. He had summoned her to his chambers, his face twisted with a cruelty that belied his poetic pretensions. She could still feel the phantom sting of the whip, the humiliation of being beaten by the very hand she was trying to protect. He had screamed at her, calling her a fraud, threatening to have her executed in the arena if she did not produce a poison that struck like lightning. Fear, she told the class, her voice dropping an octave, is the greatest alchemist. It distills the mind. It burns away hesitation. Under the threat of death, she had retreated to her laboratory, working with a frantic, terrible precision. She needed something that bypassed the tasters, something that defied the standard protocols of the royal banquet. Britannicus was guarded. Every cup was tested by a servant before it touched his lips. How to poison a drink that had already been proven safe? The answer lay in temperature. She described the scene to her students, painting the banquet hall with words until they could hear the clatter of silver and smell the roasted meats. Britannicus had been served a cup of wine, tested by his taster and found pure, but the wine was served scalding hot, too hot to drink a deliberate error. The boy, as expected, recoiled from the heat and demanded cold water to cool the cup. "The water," Locusta whispered, holding up a clear vial of liquid that shimmered in the firelight. The tasters check the wine. They do not check the water poured from the pitcher to cool it. The cold water, laced with a potent, fast-acting extract of hemlock and sardonic herb, swirled into the hot wine. Britannicus drank deeply. The effect was instantaneous. He did not cry out. His voice was stolen before it could form a sound. His limbs seized. His eyes rolled back, and the life was extinguished before the cup hit the table. The hall had fallen into a terrified silence. Nero, reclining on his couch, had barely looked up from his meal, casually remarking that his brother was prone to falling fits and would recover soon. But the court knew, and Locusta, watching from behind a pillar, knew that she had bought her life with a boy's death. Yet even in triumph, the dead speak. Locusta moved to a shelf where a fine white powder sat in a bronze bowl. She dipped her fingers into it, rubbing the dust between her thumb and forefinger. "Gypsum," she said. "Chalk. Plaster. We use it to build walls, to cast statues, and sometimes to hide the truth." The poison she had crafted was violent. It had left Britannicus's skin mottled with dark, bruised patches, the undeniable signature of toxins that rupture the blood and stagnate the heart. A corpse that looked like a roadmap of murder could not be displayed on the funeral pyre. Nero, in his panic, had ordered the body covered. Locusta and the undertakers had worked through the night, painting the dead boy's skin with a thick layer of gypsum paste, smoothing over the bruises until he looked as pale and serene as marble. It was a perfect deception, or so they thought. But the gods of Rome have a dark sense of humor. As the funeral procession wound its way through the forum, the skies opened. A torrential rainstorm, violent and sudden, lashed down upon the city. The water soaked the funeral bier, dissolving the fresh plaster. The white mask washed away in streams of milky rain, revealing the blackened, hideously discolored face beneath. The people of Rome gasped, seeing the mark of the poisoner revealed by the heavens themselves. "We can fool the eyes of men," Locusta said, dusting the powder from her hands, "but nature always seeks its own balance. Remember that when you think you are gods." Despite the scandal, or perhaps because of the fear it inspired, Locusta's position was secured. Nero did not exile her. He exalted her. She became a fixture of the state, a dark institution unto herself. He granted her estates in the countryside, vast tracts of land where she could grow her gardens of nightshade and aconite without interference. He sent her students, these very predecessors of the ones standing before her now legitimizing her craft, as a school of thought equal to philosophy or rhetoric. But the greatest symbol of their bond, the artifact that defined her tenure as the imperial poisoner, was not a grand estate or a public title. It was something small, intimate, and terrifying. Locusta walked to the heavy iron safe embedded in the stone wall of the sanctum. She turned the key with a heavy clack and pulled the door open. From the darkness, she retrieved a small box. It was exquisite, crafted from solid gold, etched with reliefs of flowering vines that looked innocent to the untrained eye, but which she knew to be the leaves of the atrium plant. She held the golden box in the palm of her hand, the firelight catching its polished surface. The students leaned in, drawn by the allure of the gold and the promise of the secret it held. "The Emperor is the master of the world," she said softly, "but he is also a man who knows that the world is a cage. He fears the mob. He fears the Senate. He fears the day when the legions turn their spears toward Rome." She opened the lid. Inside lay a single dark vial, resting on a cushion of purple velvet. "This," she whispered, "is his final comfort. I created this for him. It is a poison of such purity, such speed, that it offers the only freedom an emperor can truly own, the freedom to choose the hour of his departure." Nero carried this box everywhere. It was his talisman against humiliation. If the rebels ever came, if the guards ever turned, he would not suffer the indignity of capture or the torture of the executioner. He would open the golden box, drink the draught Locusta had distilled, and slip into the dark like a king. It was a strange intimacy, to hold the emperor's death in her hands, to know that his ultimate safety relied not on his Praetorian guard, but on the liquid she had brewed in this very room. She snapped the box shut, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet room. "We do not just deal in death," she told them, her eyes scanning their faces, seeing the mixture of ambition and fear that she knew so well. "We deal in control. We give the powerful the illusion that they are masters of their fate. This box is the keeper of the emperor's courage." She placed the golden box back onto the table, where it sat like a small, heavy sun. The lesson was reaching its crucible. They had heard the history, they had understood the philosophy. Now they had to understand the practice. Locusta turned away from the gold and walked toward a shadowed corner of the room, where a cage sat covered by a heavy woolen cloth. The sound of rustling came from beneath the fabric, the frantic scratching of claws on wood, the soft, panicked breathing of a living thing that senses a predator. "The theory is the map," she said, her hand hovering over the cloth, "but the territory must be walked." She looked back at her students, her expression unreadable, her eyes reflecting the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist about to begin an experiment. The fire in the furnace crackled, a sudden spark popping in the silence. "Tonight, we test the dosage," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of malice, purely functional. "Tonight, we see if the lesson of the feather and the lesson of the water can be combined." She gripped the fabric, preparing to unveil the subject of their study, the final step in the night's education. The air in the room grew tighter, the anticipation hanging heavy like smoke. "Watch closely," she commanded, and pulled the cloth away. The cloth fell away to reveal a simple wooden crate, slatted and narrow, housing a frantic wild hare. Its nose twitched in a rapid, rhythmic tremor, the soft fur of its flank heaving with the instinctive terror of confinement. The students leaned in, their breath held in a collective suspension, watching the way the animal moved in the flickering amber light of the oil lamps. Locusta did not look at the hare with cruelty nor with pity. Her gaze was that of a stone mason inspecting a rough block of marble, seeing only the geometry of what must be done. She reached for a small vial on the table, the glass cool and smooth against her fingertips. Inside, a clear liquid caught the lighter distillation of aconite, carefully measured, purified through layers of wool and charcoal until it was stripped of its bitterness, leaving only the lethal essence. "The body is a fortress," she murmured, her voice weaving through the silence of the room like a slow-moving stream. "But every fortress has a gate that cannot be barred against the air it breathes or the water it craves." With the deftness born of 1,000 such nights, she introduced a single drop onto a leaf of lettuce, sliding it through the slats. The hare paused. It sniffed. The room went still. Then the animal ate. The lesson that followed was not one of violence, but of time. They watched the stages of the toxin's work, the slowing of the motor functions, the dimming of the eyes, the gradual, gentle cessation of the breath. It was quiet. It was efficient. It was the silence of the winter snow burying the field. Locusta watched the students, watching the death. She was teaching them to see the world as she did, not as a place of morality, but as a series of chemical reactions, a balance of humors that could be tipped by the weight of a single feather. But this classroom, this sanctuary of shadow and science, was merely a rehearsal for the true stage. The walls of her laboratory could not keep out the demands of the world above. The scene shifted, dissolving like smoke in a strong wind, moving from the private study of the poisoner to the marble coldness of the Palatine Hill. The year was 54 AD, and the air in Rome tasted of iron and impending rain. The city was a sprawling beast that never slept, but within the imperial palace, a different kind of wakefulness took hold. Locusta found herself no longer the teacher, but the instrument. She had been pulled from the damp darkness of a prison cell, where the threat of execution had hung over her like a heavy shroud. Her reprieve had come not from a judge, but from a mother, Agrippina the Younger, the empress, a woman whose ambition burned brighter and hotter than the brazier in Locusta's cell, had need of the Gaulish woman's particular talents. The Emperor Claudius was old. His time, in the estimation of his wife, had expired. He had served his purpose by adopting her son, Nero. And now he lingered too long, a twilight that refused to fade into night. Agrippina did not want a bloody coup. Swords made noise, and daggers left messes that were difficult to clean from the public consciousness. She required something natural. She required a death that looked like fate. Locusta stood before the empress in a chamber adorned with frescoes of gods and monsters. The contrast between them was stark, the royal woman draped in Tyrian purple and gold, and the herbalist in the simple, rough-spun tunic of a servant. Yet, in that moment, the power balance was delicate. The empress commanded the legions, but Locusta commanded the chemistry of life. "He loves mushrooms," Agrippina said, her voice low, lacking the tremor of fear. She spoke of the emperor's death as one might speak of pruning a withered branch from an olive tree. The Boletti. He eats them with greed. Make it happen there. Locusta understood. The mushroom was the perfect vessel. It was earthy, rich and strong in flavor, capable of masking the metallic tang of the arsenic or the bitter bite of the nightshade. But she knew the constitution of the emperor. Claudius was a man of excesses, his body inured to wine and rich foods. A simple dose would not suffice. It had to be potent, yet delayed enough to allow him to finish the meal, to retire, to let the palace sleep. She returned to her work, not in a damp cell, but in a hidden workspace within the palace servants' quarters. She worked with the focus of a jeweler cutting a diamond. She took the death cap, the Amanita Phalides, and extracted its essence, blending it with the white arsenic she had refined from the mines. She cooked the mixture down, reducing it to a thick, viscous syrup that clung to the spoon like honey. The night of the banquet arrived, bringing with it a storm that lashed against the 7 hills of Rome. Thunder rolled in distant, angry peals, shaking the foundations of the city, a celestial drumroll for the drama unfolding in the dining hall. Locusta did not attend the feast. She waited in the corridors, a ghost in the periphery, listening to the sounds of revelry. She could imagine the scene. The reclining bodies, the flow of Falernian wine, the laughter that sounded too loud, too brittle. The dish of mushrooms was served succulent, glistening with oil and herbs, the poison hidden in the sauce of the largest, most appetizing cap, placed specifically where the emperor would reach. Claudius ate. The reports that came back to her through the whispers of slaves were fragmented. He enjoyed the dish. He praised the cook. He called for wine. Locusta waited. The rain hammered against the roof tiles, a relentless rhythm that matched the beating of her own heart. She was not afraid of the act. She was afraid of the failure. In her trade, an unfinished death was a death sentence for the artist. Hours passed. The banquet wound down. Then the chaos began. Word rushed through the corridors like a sudden draft. The emperor was ill. But he was not dying. His stomach, accustomed to gluttony and excess, had rebelled. The wine had made him vomit. He was purging the poison before it could take hold of his heart. He lay on his couch, groaning, his face flushed, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he was alive. Panic, cold and sharp, seized the conspirators. Agrippina's eyes, wide with the terror of exposure, sought solutions. If Claudius survived the night, if he woke with a clear head and a suspicion of what had been done, the Praetorian Guard would be marching before dawn. Locusta was summoned to the edges of the imperial chamber. She could smell the sour stench of sickness and wine. She saw the emperor's physician, Xenophon, hovering over the prone body of the ruler of the world. Xenophon was a man of medicine, but he was also a creature of the court, his loyalty tethered to the rising sun of Nero rather than the setting sun of Claudius. The physician looked to the shadows where Locusta stood. No words were exchanged, only a look of dark understanding. The territory had to be walked to the end. The map could not be left half-finished. Locusta produced the second tool, the contingency she always carried. It was not a potion this time, but a paste, dark and concentrated, smeared onto the tip of a long, elegant feather, the kind used to tickle the back of the throat to induce vomiting, a common relief for Romans who had eaten too much. It was a perverse inversion of healing. The tool meant to purge the body would be the vehicle that sealed it. She handed the feather to Xenophon. The transfer was seamless, a baton pass in a race towards regicide. The physician turned back to the emperor, his face a mask of professional concern. "Let me help you, Caesar," Xenophon soothed, his voice steady over the roar of the thunder outside. "This will clear the bile. This will bring relief." Locusta watched from the doorway as the feather was lowered into the emperor's open, gasping mouth. She saw the throat convulse, the reflex to gag. The poison, potent and fast-acting upon contact with the mucous membranes, was painted directly onto the most vulnerable pathway to the blood. Claudius choked. It was a wet, heavy sound, lost quickly under the crashing of the storm. His body stiffened. A final, violent arching of the back as the toxin seized the nervous system, shutting down the signals from the brain to the lungs, from the spirit to the flesh. Then he collapsed back onto the cushions. The heaving chest stilled. The groans ceased. The room seemed to expand, the air growing thin and cold. The emperor was dead. Locusta did not smile. She felt the familiar, heavy blanket of detachment settle over her. The storm outside raged on, unaware that the world had changed, but inside the silence was absolute. She had done what was asked. She had altered the course of history with a mushroom and a feather. She slipped away before the cries of mourning could begin, retreating back into the labyrinthine darkness of the service tunnels. She knew that her work was not finished. A new reign was beginning, a reign born in poison and shadow. Nero, the golden boy, the artist, the sun god, would ascend the steps of the throne tomorrow. But Locusta knew the truth of power. She knew that those who climb to the peaks on a ladder of bones rarely kick the ladder away. They keep it close, for there are always others who need to fall. She returned to her quarters as the dawn began to break, a grey, weeping light that offered no warmth. She sat by her small furnace, the embers glowing like the eyes of a predator in the dark. She cleaned her tools. She washed the glass vials. She ground fresh herbs, the rhythmic sound of the pestle in the mortar, a grounding cadence in a world gone mad. The death of Claudius was the breaking of the dam. The water was rushing in now, turbulent and uncontrollable. She was no longer just a herbalist from Gaul, nor a simple prisoner. She was the hand of the state, the silent executioner who walked where the lictors could not go. In the days that followed, the city mourned with performative grief. The smoke of sacrifices rose to the heavens, thick and black. Nero was hailed as the new Caesar, his youth and beauty a balm to the people. But in the shadows of the palace, the young emperor was already looking at the threats that remained. He had a stepbrother, Britannicus, the true son of Claudius, a boy who, by blood and right, had a claim that threatened the golden dawn of Nero's age. Locusta felt the summons before it arrived. She felt it in the way the guards looked at her, with a mixture of awe and revulsion. She felt it in the cold currents of the palace air. The storm that had broken the night Claudius died had not passed, it had merely changed direction. She stood in her workspace, surrounded by the dried bundles of hemlock and wolfsbane hanging from the ceiling like sleeping bats. She picked up a jar of gypsum, the white powder fine as dust, and let it sift through her fingers. It was a substance used to whiten skin, to mask imperfections, to hide the truth. "The map expands," she whispered to the empty room. The door behind her creaked open. She did not turn. She knew who it was. The heavy, hurried footsteps of a Praetorian, the messenger of a boy king who was already learning that absolute power requires absolute silence from one's enemies. Locusta. The guard's voice was rough, echoing against the stone. The Emperor requires an audience. She wiped her hands on her apron, the white gypsum dust leaving ghostly prints on the fabric. She did not tremble. She had survived the dungeon. She had survived the condemnation. She had survived the test of the feather. She was essential now. She turned to face the guard, her face a mask of calm composure. The storm was no longer outside. It was here, in the heart of the empire, and she was the eye of it. "I am ready," she said, and her voice was the sound of a closing tomb. She followed the guard out into the corridor, leaving the safety of her herbs for the dangerous brightness of the throne room. As she walked, her mind began to calculate dosages again, shifting from the heavy, sluggish chemistry required for an old man to the sharper, more volatile mixtures needed for a youth. The territory was changing, and she would have to walk it carefully, for the ground beneath her was slick with blood, and the sky above was dark with the wings of vultures waiting to descend. The heavy bronze doors of the imperial dining hall swung open, releasing a wave of heat, noise, and the rich, cloying scent of roasted meats and spikenard oil. Locusta stepped across the threshold, not as a guest, but as a shadow attending the light. The young Emperor Nero sat reclined, his face flushed with wine and anticipation, while his stepbrother Britannicus, the rival whose existence was a thorn in the new regime's side, sat nearby, guarded by his own tasters. The air in the room was thick with tension, invisible to the courtiers, but palpable to one who dealt in the chemistry of life and death. Locusta watched from the periphery, her eyes fixed on the cupbearer. She had prepared for this moment with the precision of a master artisan. The poison was not in the wine, nor was it in the food, for the boy's tasters were vigilant, testing every morsel that passed his lips. She had crafted a trap within a kindness. A servant brought Britannicus a cup of hot drink. Steaming and fragrant, it was tested, tasted, and deemed safe. But as the boy took the cup, he complained it was too hot, just as Locusta had predicted. With a bow, the servant poured a splash of cold water into the vessel to cool it. The water had not been tested. The water held the essence of the nightshade, distilled to a potency that allowed no time for remedies. Britannicus drank. He swallowed the cool relief, and within seconds, the relief turned to silence. The cup clattered to the marble floor. His breath ceased, his eyes rolled back, and the convulsions began. The banquet hall erupted in gasps, but Nero remained reclining, waving a dismissive hand. He claimed it was merely a falling sickness, a fit of epilepsy to which his brother was prone. As the boy's life flickered and extinguished on the cold stone, Locusta did not smile. She merely observed the efficacy of her work, the sudden cessation of the heart, the terrifying speed of the toxin. Yet, death by poison leaves its mark. As the body of Britannicus cooled, a strange discoloration began to spread across his skin, a bruised violet darkness that betrayed the unnatural cause of his end. Panic fluttered through the palace servants. If the public saw the boy's blackened face, the cry of murder would rise from the streets. Nero commanded a cover-up. Under the cover of night, Locusta and the imperial undertakers worked with frantic haste. They mixed gypsum, a white chalky plaster, and painted the boy's face, masking the bruised evidence of the toxin under a layer of artificial purity. He looked pristine, pale, and peaceful, a marble statue ready for the pyre. But the gods of Rome were not so easily deceived. On the day of the funeral, the skies over the Campus Martius darkened. A torrential rainstorm broke over the procession, a deluge of water that lashed against the mourners and the corpse alike. The rain was relentless. It soaked the funeral couch and washed over the face of the dead prince. Slowly, the white gypsum began to run. The plaster dissolved into milky streams, revealing the dark, mottled skin beneath. The crowd gasped as the face of murder was unveiled by the storm, the blackened features staring up at the weeping sky. The people whispered of fratricide, but fear kept their voices low. Nero was absolute, and Locusta, the architect of this dark miracle, was no longer a prisoner. She was a savior to the throne. Her reprieve was absolute. The emperor, delighted by her ruthlessness and the removal of his greatest threat, granted her a pardon that swept away all previous condemnations. But he gave her more than life. He gave her power. He gifted her vast estates in the countryside, sprawling lands where she could cultivate her gardens of death in peace. For the first time in her life, Locusta was not a slave, not a prisoner, and not a fugitive. She was a landowner, a woman of means, and the head of a dark institution. Nero sent her students, young men and women, curious about the botanical arts, effectively sanctioning a state-sponsored school for poisoners. The countryside estate became a university of shadows. Here, far from the intrigues of the Palatine Hill, the air smelled of hemlock, aconite, and flowering oleander. She walked her gardens in the early morning mist, her fingers brushing against the velvety leaves of the belladonna, checking the ripening berries of the yew. She taught her pupils how to distill the essence of monkshood, how to mask the bitter taste of arsenic with honey and wine, and how to calculate the dosage for a slow, wasting illness versus a sudden, stopping heart. She was cold in her instruction. The fire of her survival instinct had crystallized into a chilling detachment. Ancient historians speak of her testing her concoctions on animals, and when the dosage required calibration for human physiology, she used slaves provided by the emperor. She watched their final moments, not with cruelty, but with the clinical eye of a scholar, noting the time of onset, the pallor of the skin, and the rhythm of the fading pulse. She was perfecting an art form that Rome pretended to despise but desperately needed. Years passed in this strange, gilded safety. She became a fixture of the Neroian terror, a woman whose name was whispered to frighten children and silence enemies. She walked the halls of the palace with impunity, the emperor's shadow, always ready with a vial or a powder, should a senator become too vocal or a wealthy aunt live too long. But the higher one climbs on the ladder of bones, the more precarious the footing becomes. As the years turned, the madness of the emperor grew. The empire groaned under the weight of his excesses, his fires, and his tyranny. The legions in the provinces began to stir. Rebellion was no longer a whisper. It was a trumpet blast on the horizon. Nero, sensing the encroaching darkness, came to Locusta one last time. He did not ask for the death of a rival. He asked for the means to end his own life. He feared the mob. He feared the Senate. He feared the excruciating execution reserved for enemies of the state. He demanded a poison that was swift, painless, and absolute. Locusta went to her laboratory, her sanctuary of glass vials and dried roots. She compounded a mixture of supreme potency, a distillation of her life's work. She placed the toxin in a small, golden box, a vessel worthy of a king's death. She gave it to him, and he kept it close, a final escape route hidden in the folds of his robes. But when the end finally came, when the Senate declared him a public enemy, and the horsemen were thundering toward the villa where he hid, Nero lost his nerve. In the chaotic flight from the palace, amidst the terror of his final hours, the golden box was misplaced. The master poisoner's final gift was lost to history. Nero was forced to rely on the blade of a freedman to find his exit from the world. With the emperor dead, the silence that fell over Rome was heavy and brief. It was the silence of a held breath before the scream. The year of the 4 emperors had begun, and the first to seize the purple was Galba. Old, severe, and unforgiving, Galba marched into Rome not to celebrate, but to purge. He had no love for the excesses of the previous reign. He looked upon the courtiers, the spies, the jesters, and the assassins who had thrived under Nero, and he saw only a disease that needed to be cut away. The protection that Locusta had enjoyed, the immunity that had seemed as solid as the marble pillars of the Forum, evaporated in an instant. Soldiers came to her estate. There was no request for her services this time. There was no negotiation. They dragged her from her garden, away from the meticulously tended rows of foxglove and hellebore. They shackled her wrists, the iron biting into skin that had known only the touch of petals and gold for nearly a decade. She was brought back to Rome, not as a guest, but as a trophy of the purge. Galba ordered her to be led through the city in chains. This was the final procession. The streets of Rome were a canyon of noise and hatred. The mob, which had once cheered Nero's games, now turned its voracious hunger on his favourites. They lined the Via Sacra, jeering and spitting as the woman of poisons was paraded before them. Locusta walked with her head high, her face a mask of Gaulish stone. She did not weep. She did not beg. She had lived a life of borrowed time since the days of Claudius, and she knew that the debt was finally due. She looked at the faces in the crowd, distorted by rage, hungry for blood, and saw the same animal nature she had observed in her experiments. They were all creatures of instinct, driven by fear and appetite. She had been the apex predator in the ecosystem of the palace, but now the ecosystem had shifted, and she was the prey. The myth that would later surround her death spoke of wild beasts, of a giraffe trained to ravage her, a fantastical and grotesque end invented by storytellers to match the grotesque nature of her reputation. But the reality was colder, more Roman, and more final. Galba was a man of discipline. He did not want a circus. He wanted an execution. Locusta was led to the place of punishment, the air thick with the dust of the city and the smell of impending violence. The executioner waited. There was no golden box for her, no painless exit drafted from her own genius. There was only the sword or the rope, the crude instruments of men who knew nothing of the supple art of botany. As she stood before the darkness, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade, replaced by the memory of the deep, silent woods of Gaul. She remembered the smell of damp earth, the pattern of veins on a hemlock leaf, the quiet hum of bees in the aconite. She had travelled far from those woods, walked through the fire of the imperial court, and shaped the history of the world with a few drops of liquid. The executioner stepped forward. The sun caught the edge of the steel. Locusta closed her eyes, exhaling a breath that carried no poison, only the final resignation of a ghost accepting its tomb. The blade fell, and the career of the first serial killer of the West came to its end. Her body was cast aside, left for the birds and the dogs, returned to the cycle of nature she had manipulated for so long. The lineage of the Julio-Claudian dynasty had been pruned and shaped by her hand. But the gardener herself was now cut down, her secrets seeping into the thirsty ground of Rome. The city moved on. The reign of Galba would be short, followed by Otho, then Vitellius, then Vespasian. The wheel of fortune continued to turn, grinding stones and bones alike. But in the apothecaries and the dark corners of the empire, the legend of Locusta lingered. She became a cautionary tale, a whisper in the dark, a patron saint of the desperate and the cruel. Night settled over the 7 hills. The rain began to fall again, gently this time, washing the dust from the cobblestones of the forum. It washed away the blood of the day's executions, carrying it down into the sewers, into the Tiber, and out to the endless, indifferent sea. The story of the poisoner faded into the stones, waiting to be unearthed by time, while the city slept a fitful, uneasy sleep, dreaming of emperors and the shadows that stand behind them. The darkness deepened, wrapping the world in a shroud of velvet quiet, ending the era of the poisoner and inviting the silence to take. But silence, in the Empire of Rome, was a deceptive thing. Even as the physical form of Locusta was removed from the world, dragged through the streets in the iron chains of Emperor Galba's retribution, her shadow had already stretched far beyond the reach of the executioner's blade. The silence she left behind was not an emptiness, but a heavy, pregnant pause in the conversation of history, a quiet that hung over the banquet tables of the elite for generations to come. Though the woman from Gaul was gone, the knowledge she had cultivated did not perish with her. It is said that during her favoured years, under the protection of Nero, she had not merely been a solitary practitioner of the dark arts. She had become an institution in the sprawling estates granted to her by the emperor, amidst the manicured gardens where wolfsbane and hemlock grew alongside roses and laurel. She had instructed others. Nero, in his paranoia and fascination, had sent students to her shadowy figures, slaves with sharp minds and ambitious freedmen who sought to understand the quiet power of the leaf and the root. These students, the graduates of her silent university, dissolved back into the populace after her fall. They carried with them the recipes of the master. They knew the precise measurement of aconite required to stop a heart without leaving a trace. They knew how to distill the essence of the belladonna berry until it was tasteless in wine. They knew the secrets of the mushroom that mimics the symptoms of natural illness. Locusta's legacy was thus sewn into the fabric of the Roman underworld, a diaspora of toxicity that ensured no cup would ever be raised with total confidence again. The terror she had inspired was not merely due to the death she dealt, but the clinical detachment with which she dealt it. Rome was a civilization built on the sword and the spear, weapons of passion and visceral violence. Blood was spilled in the heat of the arena or the chaos of the battlefield, but Locusta represented something colder, something more terrifyingly modern. She was a scientist of mortality. In the quiet chambers of her estate, away from the screaming crowds of the Circus Maximus, she had conducted her work with the patience of a scholar. The historians who chronicled her life spoke of her experiments with a mixture of revulsion and awe. She had tested her concoctions on animals, observing the twitch of a muscle, the dilation of a pupil, the slowing of a breath, refining her dosages until she achieved a mastery over death that rivaled the fates themselves. This cold rationality, this reduction of human life to a chemical equation, was the true horror she bequeathed to the world. She stripped the act of killing of its glory and left only the biological inevitability of cessation. Her phantom presence lingered most palpably in the objects that survived the collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. It is whispered that for years a small golden box remained hidden among the personal effects of the emperors, a cursed heirloom passed from hand to hand or buried in the vaults of the Palatine. This was the box Locusta had prepared for Nero, containing a poison of such swift and merciful potency that it was intended to be his final escape. The emperor, who believed himself a god and an artist, had kept this golden vessel close to his chest, a talisman against the indignity of capture. Yet, in his final chaotic hours, as the Praetorian Guard closed in and the world turned against him, the box was nowhere to be found. The poisoner's final gift had vanished, leaving Nero to face the steel of his own dagger with trembling hands. The box became a legend in itself, a symbol of the ultimate unreliability of power. It was a reminder that even the most carefully prepared contingencies of emperors are subject to the whims of fortune. The golden box, filled with Locusta's dark genius, remains one of history's lost artifacts, waiting perhaps in some buried chamber beneath the roots of a modern city. Its contents as lethal today as they were 2,000 years ago. And there were other echoes, memories etched into the very soil of Rome. Men of the Senate, old and grey, would still shudder when the autumn rains fell, remembering the funeral of Britannicus. They remembered the young prince, the rival Nero had been so desperate to eliminate. They remembered how Locusta had been flogged by the emperor's own hand for her initial failure, and how she had returned to her cauldron with a terrifying focus to brew the final draught. But most of all, they remembered the rain. They remembered how the body of the prince had been prepared, his skin stained a dark, unnatural violet by the toxins that had stopped his heart. To conceal this evidence of foul play, the agents of the palace had covered the corpse in gypsum, painting him with a mask of white plaster to simulate the pallor of natural death. But the heavens had not conspired with the poisoner that day. As the funeral procession wound its way through the forum, a torrential downpour had unleashed itself upon the city. The rain had washed away the gypsum, dissolving the white lie to reveal the bruised and blackened truth beneath. It was a moment of macabre revelation, a sign that the earth itself rejected the secrets of the Palatine. Locusta, the woman of the wilds, the daughter of Gaul, had tried to tame nature, to bottle it and bend it to the will of a tyrant. But nature, in the end, is the only true sovereign. The rain washes away the plaster. The gypsum crumbles. The truth of the rot is exposed. In the centuries that followed, the name Locusta became a byword, a moniker used to slander powerful women, a trope deployed by historians to paint the emperors as weak men controlled by feminine wiles. They cast her as a sorceress, a witch of the hedge, stripping her of her agency and her intellect, reducing her to a caricature of villainy. But beneath the layers of Roman propaganda, the faint outline of the real woman persists. She was a survivor, a stranger in a land of iron and marble, who used the only weapons available to her, the knowledge of the earth, the secrets of the stem and the seed. She walked a razor's edge between the dungeon and the palace, serving monsters to delay her own destruction, until the wheel of fortune finally broke her. As the Roman Empire slowly crumbled, fragmenting under the weight of its own excess and the pressure of the barbarian tides, the physical remnants of Locusta's world turned to dust. The villas where she had trained her poisoners were reclaimed by the creeping ivy. The gardens where she had harvested henbane were swallowed by the forests. The marble busts of Nero were smashed and buried in the mud. Yet, in the quiet places of the world, her legacy endured. It lived on in the apothecary's jar. It lived on in the apothecary's jar. It lived on in the careful study of botany. It lived on in the fear that causes a king to switch goblets with his guest. The silent legacy of Locusta is the enduring knowledge that death can come not with a roar, but with a whisper. It is the understanding that the most dangerous things in the world are often the most beautiful. The bright berry, the delicate flower, the clear, cool water in a silver cup. Now the city of Rome is a tapestry of ruins and modern lights, layered over the bones of the past. The Forum is quiet at night, save for the wind that whistles through the broken columns. The rain still falls, washing the ancient stones, just as it did on the day the gypsum ran in white rivulets from the face of a dead prince. The ghosts of the Caesars have faded into the mist, and with them the shadow of the woman who held their lives in a vial. The story is finished. The poison has lost its potency. The golden box is lost to time. The chains have rusted into the earth. The struggle for survival, the terror of the court, the desperate clawing for power, all of it, has settled into the deep, undisturbed sediment of history. There is no more need for vigilance. The cup is empty. The heavy curtains of time have been drawn across the stage. The air grows still. The heartbeat of the city slows to a rhythmic slumber. The darkness is not a threat, but a blanket, soft and enveloping. The plants in the garden close their petals for the night, returning to the innocent sleep of the earth. Everything that was sharp has been dulled by the centuries. Everything that was loud has been hushed. Rest now, in the safety of this distance. The past cannot touch you here. The legends have retired to their books, and the spirits have drifted away into the ether. There is only the quiet, the calm, and the deep, restorative peace of the end. Good night.